If you've spent any time at all on West 35th Street, you know there are hours when a telephone is an instrument of useful civilization, and hours when it's a blasphemy against nature itself. Midnight falls squarely in the latter category. At that hour, even the city outside lowers its voice to a respectful murmur. The taxis drag their heels through empty intersections. The neighbors who signed up for the night shift of domestic quarreling have gone hoarse, and whatever demon invented the party line at the Gazette has mercifully retreated to his lair. Our phone rang at 12 on a Tuesday night in early November, when the steam heat was doing its impression of an asthmatic dragon and the radiator by the office window had settled into a wheeze that harmonized perfectly with the gentle rumble emanating from the red leather chair across from my desk. Nero Wolfe, if you must have the technical details, does not snore. He will tell you he does not sleep in his office either. He may close his eyes and let a book droop across his considerable stomach for 20 minutes while the world circulates respectfully around him, but that is not sleep. It is, he has explained with the patience of a professor addressing a particularly dim student, a recess of faculties. If you doubt this distinction, you're welcome to discuss it with him personally. At any rate, at that delicate moment when his faculties had recessed and mine were occupied with the mundane task of itemizing the day's expenses, cab fares, lunch at Rusterman's, and an item labeled mood enhancement, which the Internal Revenue Service stubbornly refuses to recognize as a legitimate business expense, the telephone gave its shriek of indignation. I snatched up the receiver before it could deliver a second assault on the evening's peace. "Nero Wolfe's office," I said, keeping my voice low. "Archie Goodwin speaking." There was a breath on the line that wasn't mine, a woman's breath, crisp and controlled, but with an underlying tremor that suggested her composure was being maintained through sheer force of will. Not the brittle kind of control that comes from a bottle, but the disciplined variety that belongs to someone who keeps her shoulders square when the doctor delivers unwelcome news. "I was instructed to call this number at midnight precisely," she said, her voice carrying the kind of educated authority that usually comes with a corner office and a secretary who screens calls. "I was told you would answer." "Is this Mr. Wolfe?" "Technically, yes," I replied, glancing at the motionless form in the red leather chair. "You have reached the office of a Mr. Wolfe, and you'll get him if you make it worth his time. But if you're expecting to hear a baritone voice, I regret to inform you that you've landed on a tenor. Perhaps I can be of assistance?" "Is Mr. Wolfe awake?" Her voice could have cut crystal. Across from me, Wolfe hadn't moved so much as an eyelash, but I caught the subtle shift in his breathing that told me his faculties were peeking through the cracks of their recess. "He is awake enough," I said carefully. "What exactly brings you to our telephone at this ungodly hour?" Instead of answering directly, she said, "I can hear you breathing, Mr. Goodwin." I gave her a moment of polite silence, during which the old Bell telephone system provided its customary background hiss. Then she continued, "I was instructed to call this number and inform you that I would comply with their demands. They said if I refused, certain photographs would be delivered to the Board of Trustees in the morning. I'm not a coward, Mr. Goodwin, but neither am I an exhibitionist." On the other side of the desk, Wolfe's breathing pattern changed again. One enormous foot, encased in its customary yellow slipper, became visible beneath the edge of the chair. The slow, deliberate flex of his toe told me his attention was now fully engaged, though he maintained the pretense of sleep with the skill of a master actor. "I see," I said, keeping my tone conversational. "And they would be whom exactly?" "The note was unsigned," she replied. "It was a typed card, placed in my evening wrap while I attended the Philharmonic." The message was quite specific. "Call 212-555-9040 at midnight. Tell him you will reverse the vote, or the photographs go to the trustees. That is your number, is it not?" "It is indeed," I confirmed. though I was beginning to feel like a man who had opened his front door to find a tiger on the doorstep. I'm curious how you came by it, since it's not listed in any directory. That, Mr. Goodwin, is precisely why I'm calling. My name is Mrs. Helene Vale Fraser. The name settled into my consciousness like a well-dressed visitor taking a seat in an expensive chair. I knew it, though not personally. It belonged to the social pages and the cultural section of the better newspapers, usually accompanied by phrases like distinguished philanthropist and long-time patron of the arts. More specifically, it belonged to the chairwoman of the Hawley Foundation for Science and Society, one of those well-endowed organizations that distributed substantial grants to worthy causes, while maintaining the kind of dignified discretion that money can buy. Wolfe's foot found the floor with deliberate precision. He didn't sit up. That would have required an admission that he had been listening. But his eyes opened to reveal slits of keen intelligence studying me with the intensity of a jeweler examining a suspicious diamond. "You mentioned a vote, Mrs. Fraser," I said. "Which vote would that be?" "The executive committee meets at 9 this morning," she explained, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "At noon, we are scheduled to announce the recipients of this year's grants. We have already taken our preliminary votes, and the allocations are in place. Apparently, someone has a significant interest in altering our decision. And you have no idea who might want such a change. None whatsoever. The grants are awarded based on merit and need, not on personal preference or outside influence. That has always been our policy." She paused, and I heard the sound of papers rustling. "Mr. Goodwin, I want to be clear about something. I have nothing in my past or present that could be used against me in photographs, at least not in any conventional sense. But I understand how these things work. Even the most innocent image can be twisted by malicious interpretation, especially when presented to people who are looking for reasons to doubt one's judgment." Across from me, Wolfe inhaled deeply, and I caught the familiar aroma of beer and contemplation. His eyes were fully open now, fixed on me with the kind of attention he usually reserved for a particularly challenging orchid or an especially well-prepared meal. "I was instructed to call and say I would comply," Mrs. Fraser continued. "Instead, I'm calling to say that I will not. I will not alter a vote based on threats, no matter how cleverly orchestrated. But I would very much like to speak with Mr. Wolfe this morning if he will see me." "He will," I said, making the decision for both of us. Wolfe's slight nod confirmed that I had read his intentions correctly. "What time can you be here?" 7 o'clock? "Not a chance," I told her firmly. "Mr. Wolfe maintains a monogamous relationship with his bed at that hour, and I wouldn't dream of disturbing their intimacy. How about 8:30? 8:30 is when the committee meets. Then 8:15. We can smell panic at that hour, and it tends to sharpen our focus." She agreed, and I gave her the address and specific directions, along with stern instructions not to mention Mr. Wolfe's name to anyone and to take evasive action if she suspected she was being followed. After she hung up, I replaced the receiver and looked across the desk at my employer. Wolfe had allowed his eyelids to droop again, but he was far from sleep. His mouth had settled into the thin line that indicated he was measuring something he could not yet see clearly. "You don't like midnight calls," I observed. "I detest them," he replied, his voice carrying the rumble he reserved for weather that had failed to meet his approval. "I particularly detest vulgarity in all its forms, and this represents vulgarity of the highest order, using another man's telephone number as bait in a scheme of extortion." "So you caught the essential point," I said. "She didn't find our number in the Manhattan directory." "Puis." He opened his eyes fully and fixed me with a stare. "Our number is unlisted, Archie. Mrs. Fraser may be many things, but she is not naive. She would not have our number unless someone deliberately placed it in her hands, and that someone did so for the specific purpose of involving me in their scheme, either as an unwitting accomplice or as a convenient scapegoat." His voice grew colder. That constitutes an unacceptable presumption. Not to mention rude, I added. It woke you up. He allowed himself the ghost of a snort. Do not attempt wit at this hour, Archie. It sits poorly on both of us. I leaned back in my chair and considered the situation. So what do we think? That some enterprising individual is using our unlisted telephone number as a prop in an extortion scheme? Because if the plan was to implicate you in blackmailing society matrons, someone clearly doesn't understand your particular area of expertise. Stop playing with it, Wolfe said sharply. And this time he did sit up, not much, but enough to signal that the evening's entertainment had officially begun. His eyes were alert now, and his mouth had assumed the expression that meant he was measuring an opponent he had not yet met. The facts are simple. Mrs. Fraser chairs a committee that controls substantial sums of money. At noon today, they will announce the distribution of that money. She received instructions to alter a preliminary vote. The malicious party used my telephone number, which is not available to the general public. To suggest this is coincidence would be to suggest that pigs have developed aviation skills. His large hand closed deliberately on the arm of his chair. We will assist her. You'll see her at 8:15, I agreed. The question is why. He looked at me with what might have been amusement or might have been hunger. Because, Archie, he said with admirable economy, I eat. It's remarkable how much meaning a man can pack into a single syllable when he weighs 1/7 of a ton and has spent a lifetime wrestling words into submission. That sentence could be interpreted as a simple statement of financial necessity, which it was. It could also be understood as an expression of professional pride, since Fritz's dinner tomorrow night would rest easier if the house had not been used as a theatrical prop by persons unknown. But there was a third interpretation, and this is where I give Wolfe full credit. There is a kind of consumption that has nothing to do with food and everything to do with appetite. The appetite for devouring the presumption of someone who thinks he can use your home as his personal telephone exchange. Still, a thought had occurred to me, and I voiced it. The Hawley Foundation, don't they award a botanical grant each year? Wolfe's eyelids lifted slightly. He didn't answer the question directly, but then again, he didn't need to. I knew the greenhouse schedule upstairs better than most people know their own birthdays. The botanical grant in question had featured prominently in last spring's horticultural journals, complete with a modest line item for orchid propagation and greenhouse rehabilitation. If you think Nero Wolfe is indifferent to the welfare of other people's orchids, you probably also believe he eats vegetables because they're good for him. All right, I said. We help her. Do we inform Inspector Kramer? That earned me a look that could have frozen beer in July. Inform Inspector Kramer of what, precisely? That some creative individual is using our telephone number to facilitate extortion. He appreciates being kept in the loop. He appreciates being in the loop the way a python appreciates a rabbit. Wolfe corrected. There has been no crime committed, Archie, merely an act of presumption. We will not summon the police to protect Mrs. Fraser's sensibilities. If a crime develops, we will inform the inspector at the appropriate time. He pointed one finger at the telephone. You will contact Saul Panzer. My eyebrows rose. Wolfe doesn't bring Saul into a case before it becomes a case unless he's preparing to teach fate a lesson in manners. On what grounds? On the grounds that anyone clever enough to obtain our unlisted number and audacious enough to use it will likely attempt to obtain other things as well. The day ahead promises to be eventful, and I want Saul available by 11 o'clock. Consider it done, I said. Should I warn Fritz to prepare for company? That produced a genuine glint of anticipation. No, he said, but inform him that I have consented to receive a visitor at 8:15. He will require time to compose his reproach. This was sound advice. If you have never been on the receiving end of a reproach from Fritz Brenner for disrupting the household schedule, you have missed one of life's more educational experiences. It's like being lectured on ethics by a Swiss banker who has discovered a higher calling in the kitchen. Wolfe's eyes closed again, but this time it was genuine fatigue rather than theatrical repose. "One more thing, Archie," he added as I reached for the house phone. "Engage the security chain on the front door." I did as instructed. The chain is not mere decoration. We live in a large city and accept its conveniences, but we are not missionaries seeking to convert every passing stranger to our way of life. The chain went on. The front hall light remained burning, and Fritz's slippers stood at attention by the kitchen door like small leather sentinel. When morning arrived, and I use the term loosely, since 8 o'clock hardly qualifies as morning in a house accustomed to a civilized 9 o'clock start, the kitchen smelled of coffee and barely suppressed indignation. Fritz wore his navy robe, which meant he had been persuaded to abandon the comfort of his bed by duty and principle rather than enthusiasm. He served my coffee with the precision of a man presenting evidence to a hostile jury. "Mr. Wolfe consents to 8:15, he said, his accent lending additional gravity to his disapproval. "This woman is clearly a barbarian." "She's a patron of the arts," I replied diplomatically. "They're civilized at least until intermission. Don't worry, you can deliver a proper lecture later. In the meantime, we have a visitor to manage and a potential crisis to resolve." He sniffed, a sound that could have been patented as the definitive expression of Swiss disapproval. At precisely 8:15, the doorbell announced our visitor with its customary discretion. Through the one-way glass panel, I could see Mrs. Helene Vale Fraser had earned every initial in her name. She was tall and carried herself with the kind of unconscious authority that comes from years of presiding over committees and making decisions that affect other people's lives. Her hair was the color of distinguished silver, her coat suggested a personal relationship with an expensive tailor, and her eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. She carried a small leather portfolio in her left hand and wore the expression of a woman who had spent the night thinking rather than sleeping. "Mrs. Fraser," I said, opening the door and stepping aside. "Punctuality is a virtue we hold in high regard. Please come in." I took her coat and escorted her to the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk as if he had been carved from the chair itself. He did not rise, he never does, for anyone, regardless of gender, social standing, or moral character. Instead, he inclined his head in a gesture that, coming from him, represented the equivalent of a full military salute. "Mrs. Fraser," he said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy he reserved for clients who had demonstrated both intelligence and backbone. "Please be seated. I should warn you that I have an aversion to haste and our time is necessarily limited. Therefore, I shall be direct. Explain." She settled into the red leather chair with the composure of someone who had spent years taking her place at important tables. From her portfolio, she withdrew a small white card and a folder of papers. "The card was placed in my wrap during the intermission last night," she said, handing me the evidence. "And these are copies of our preliminary vote tallies." I examined the card first. It was plain white stock, the kind you might find at any stationery store, with a single line of text in unremarkable typeface. "Call 212-555-9040 at midnight. Tell him you will reverse the vote, or the photographs go to the trustees. No signature, no watermark. No helpful fingerprints left by someone who had clearly read the same detective novels I had." The vote tallies were more interesting. 3 grants were listed. One to an epidemiology laboratory at Columbia University that promised to make every microbe in the city nervous. One to a researcher in Albany who had revolutionary ideas about algae, and one to the Bronx Botanical Garden. The last entry included a detailed description, greenhouse rehabilitation, and orchid propagation program, $250,000. Someone had penciled "contested" in the margin, followed by a question mark that seemed to lean toward uncertainty. Wolfe accepted the papers from me and gave them the kind of quick, comprehensive examination that a master chef might give to ingredients for a familiar recipe. Who comprises your committee, Mrs. Fraser? She provided the names with the efficiency of someone reading from a mental file cabinet. Dr. Leonid Keston, a botanist whose early promise had been followed by years of quiet research. Graham Colby, the Foundation's legal counsel, whose reputation for expensive accessories was matched only by his skill at navigating complex financial regulations. Iris Quatermain, who held a position of authority at the Museum of Natural History and wrote educational materials that made children feel intellectually inadequate. Vincent Merton, representing Merton Petrochemical, whose jaw suggested he approached philanthropy with the same determination he brought to business negotiations. And Nora Kent, a young woman who managed strategic programs, which could mean anything or nothing depending on the day of the week. You preside over this group, Wolfe observed. I do, she confirmed. And I do not alter votes because someone places anonymous threats in my evening wear. The threat was not anonymous, Wolfe corrected. It was unsigned. There is a significant difference. The person who placed that card in your possession knew precisely where to find you, knew your schedule, and knew the internal workings of your committee well enough to target a specific vote. This suggests intimate knowledge of your organization. He leaned back slightly. Who had the opportunity to place the card? Mrs. Fraser considered this, her fingers interlacing and separating in a gesture that suggested careful thought. Potentially dozens of people, she said finally. The Philharmonic was crowded last night. My wrap was on the back of my chair during the performance. Anyone in the surrounding seats could have managed it during the intermission when people were moving about freely. That is not particularly helpful, Wolfe said without making it sound like criticism, but perhaps it is sufficient for our purposes. He fixed her with his most penetrating stare. Mrs. Fraser, I will state this clearly to prevent any misunderstanding. I will not serve as your shield while you betray your colleagues. My office is not a sanctuary for those who wish to commit treachery in comfort. If you engage my services, you consent to complete honesty. I have nothing to hide, she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. I have no photographs that could be used against me, no secrets that would concern the trustees. If I did, I would not be sitting in your office. Wolfe accepted this with a slight nod. Very well. Then we must assume either that the photographs do not exist and the threat is mere bluff designed to test your resolve, or that they exist but will not show what they purport to show. We must also assume that someone wished to involve me in this affair, which I find unacceptable. Unacceptable to you, she said. To me, it is merely terrifying. Unacceptable to me, he agreed, and therefore of concern to you, if you choose to hire me. There is one additional condition. She waited. You will bring your committee here this afternoon. All of them. Her composure flickered for the first time. Here? Today? At 3 o'clock, he said, as if discussing the weather forecast for next Tuesday. You will inform them that you have engaged me to investigate an impropriety that has already intruded upon my household. You will request their presence for the sake of the Foundation's reputation and their own professional dignity. If any of them refuse, you will question their motives publicly. She looked at me briefly, perhaps hoping to see some indication that this was Wolfe's idea of humor. I maintained a carefully neutral expression. When Wolfe decides to bring the circus to his office, he doesn't consult the elephants about their preferences. I can make the request, she said carefully. Vincent Merton will come because he dislikes being excluded from anything that might affect his interests. Graham Colby will attend because lawyers are naturally drawn to potential conflicts. Dr. Keston will come if he believes it's necessary for the Foundation's welfare. Miss Quatermain will attend because she won't want to appear uncooperative. Nora Kent will come because she's frightened. Frightened of what? Yesterday, after our preliminary meeting, Several of us noticed a man who seemed to be following us when we left the building. It may have been coincidence, but Nora was quite upset about it. Wolfe's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Describe this man." Mrs. Fraser smiled thinly. "He wore a brown hat and kept his distance. I'm afraid that's all any of us noticed." "That significantly narrows our search," I said. "We'll just interview every man in Manhattan who owns brown headwear." Wolfe ignored my commentary, which is his way of acknowledging that I've made a point worth considering. He turned back to Mrs. Fraser. "You will make the calls immediately. Inform them that I do not leave this office under any circumstances, so they need not expect me to travel. Tell them I am available at 3 o'clock precisely. Meanwhile, you will attempt nothing, alter nothing, and whisper into no ears. If photographs exist, let them develop in their chemical baths while we examine the situation. We will determine the source of this presumption." She stood, her decision made. "I'll call them now. Use the telephone on Mr. Goodwin's desk," Wolfe instructed. "Archie will listen on the extension. Not because I question your honesty, but because I question everyone else's." The calls proceeded exactly as she had predicted. Merton agreed to attend with the brisk efficiency of a man who viewed every meeting as a potential business opportunity. Colby expressed delight, using a tone that suggested he found the entire situation entertainingly dramatic. Dr. Kesten made sounds like a reluctant bear being coaxed from hibernation, but eventually consented. Iris Quatermain said, "I see," twice, followed by, "Very well," as if she were operating unfamiliar machinery. Nora Kent's voice was small and grateful, with an underlying tension that practically vibrated through the telephone line. When Mrs. Fraser completed her calls, Wolfe raised one hand in dismissal. "Thank you. Mr. Goodwin will see you out. Retain the card, Archie, and contact both Saul and Fred. I want them available this afternoon." "Fred Durkin as well?" I asked. "What do you need him for?" "Mr. Panzer for his intelligence," Wolfe replied. "Mr. Durkin for his feet, and if fortune smiles upon us, the only thing we will accomplish before noon is indigestion." After I escorted Mrs. Fraser to the door, I returned to find Wolfe sitting motionless, his eyes closed and his lips pushed out in the expression that means he's examining a problem from angles that haven't been invented yet. "You took this case because someone used your telephone number," I said. "Yes. And because it involves a botanical grant that includes orchid propagation?" "Yes. And because you don't like being used as a prop in other people's theatrical productions?" His mouth twitched slightly. "Archie." "Yes. Be quiet and call Saul." I was quiet, and I called Saul. But I was grinning when I did it. Whatever the midnight caller had thought they were starting, they had just purchased a front-row seat at a performance they hadn't anticipated. And if there are rules about what you don't do in this world, very high on that list is this: you don't use Nero Wolfe's unlisted telephone number as a tool in your private schemes and expect to keep your dignity intact. The day ahead promised to be educational for everyone involved. If you've ever tried to maintain a civilized breakfast schedule while Fritz Brenner delivers a lecture on the sanctity of household routines, you understand why I approached the kitchen at 8:30 with the caution of a diplomat entering hostile territory. Fritz stood at the stove, wielding a spatula with the precision of a conductor's baton, and his expression suggested that the disruption of his afternoon schedule ranked somewhere between natural disaster and personal insult. "Visitors at 3 o'clock, I announced, accepting the coffee he poured with the resigned grace of someone fulfilling an unpleasant duty. 5 committee members and 1 chairwoman, all of whom will expect to be treated like civilized human beings despite having forced their way into our afternoon." Fritz's sniff could have been registered as a formal protest with the United Nations. "The House," he said with the dignity of someone defending a sacred principle, "is not a conference room." "Tell that to Wolfe," I suggested. "He's the one who invited them." This earned me a look that suggested Fritz held me personally responsible for every disruption that had ever visited the brownstone since the day I first rang the doorbell. He returned to his eggs with the air of someone who had accepted martyrdom but retained the right to disapprove of the circumstances. With Fritz's reproach properly absorbed, I settled at my desk to begin what Wolfe refers to as the preliminary excavation, the process of digging up background information on people who may or may not be telling the truth about their involvement in someone else's scheme. My first call went to Lon Cohen at the Gazette, who answers his phone at ungodly hours, because news, like crime, keeps irregular schedules. "Archie," he said before I could announce myself, "please tell me you're calling with something more interesting than a lost cat or a disputed will. How about extortion involving a prestigious foundation, mysterious photographs, and someone using Wolfe's unlisted number as a prop in their private theater?" "Now you have my attention," Lon said, and I could hear him reaching for a pencil. "What do you need?" I gave him the names of the Hawley Foundation committee members and requested the kind of background information that doesn't appear in official biographies. Lon delivered with the efficiency of someone who keeps files on half of Manhattan's professional class. "Helene Fraser is clean as fresh snow," he began. "Widow of Fraser Industrial Tools, philanthropist by profession, and someone who writes checks without expecting her name carved in marble. The foundation's legitimate, which is why it rarely makes headlines. Dr. Leonid Keston used to be the golden boy of plant physiology. Published a groundbreaking paper on orchid genetics 15 years ago. Then he got into a public dispute with a colleague over research methodology. He was vindicated, but it made him cautious. Graham Colby is the kind of lawyer who bills by the quarter hour and dresses like he owns stock in Italian tailors. He redesigned Hawley's governance structure last spring, concentrating more power in the executive committee. Iris Quatermain writes children's science books that make my nephew feel intellectually inadequate, and she curates at the Natural History Museum. Sharp as a razor and twice as cutting. Vincent Merton runs Merton Petrochemical, with the philosophy that environmental responsibility and shareholder profits can coexist if you hire the right PR firm. Currently operating under an EPA consent decree. And Nora Kent is the newcomer, used to work for a public relations outfit that specialized in making corporate sins look like community partnerships. Any recent connection to the Bronx Botanical Garden? The botanical folks have been courting foundation money for a greenhouse rehabilitation project. Big ticket item, $250,000 for glass restoration and orchid propagation facilities. Fraser toured the site 3 months ago with the garden director, though she didn't turn it into a photo opportunity. Anybody unhappy about recent grant decisions? The usual academic jealousies. The algae researcher in Albany has competitors who think he's getting more attention than his work deserves, and there's some gossip that Merton's interest in environmental grants isn't entirely altruistic. His company could benefit from research into carbon capture and industrial wastewater treatment. I thanked Lon and promised to keep him informed if the story developed into something printable. Then I called Saul Panzer. "Morning, Archie," Saul said, as if 9 o'clock phone calls were a regular feature of his social calendar. "You mentioned surveillance work." "I want eyes on the Hawley Foundation building by 11, I told him. "Someone's been following committee members, and I'd like to know who's watching the watchers. Also, keep an eye on our block. If anyone shows unusual interest in the brownstone, I want to know about it." Standard observation protocol? With extra attention to anyone who looks like they're trying too hard to be invisible. "And Saul, if this gets complicated, I want Fred Durkin available for backup." "Consider it done," he said. "I'll be in position by 10:30. At 11:15, the doorbell announced our first interruption of the day. Through the one-way glass, I could see a messenger with an envelope that looked official enough to contain either legal documents or bad news. I opened the door to the chain and accepted the delivery, which was addressed to NEROWOLFE in block letters that suggested either careful anonymity or poor penmanship. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Noon. Trustees receive what they deserve. Attached was a small manila pouch that contained nothing but empty photographic sleeves, the kind that hold film negatives, but without any film to hold. I left the empty sleeves on Wolfe's desk as evidence of someone's idea of psychological warfare and continued my morning routine. At 11:30, Saul called with his first report. "Two things," he said. "First, there's a man in a tan overcoat who's been studying a subway map across from your building for the past 20 minutes. The map's been obsolete since the Carter administration, which suggests he's not actually planning a trip. Second, I observed a young woman leave the Hawley building around 11:15 in a state of considerable agitation. She met a man matching the description of our subway scholar, had what appeared to be a heated discussion, and handed him a padded envelope before taking it back. When he tried to follow her, she disappeared into a coffee shop with the skill of someone who's had practice avoiding unwanted attention. Description of the woman: mid-20s, auburn hair, nervous disposition. Could be a Miss Kent, but I'd need confirmation. And the man: 35 to 40, clean-shaven, expensive shoes, hands that suggest he's not accustomed to manual labor. He's now back on your block, apparently fascinated by urban architecture. Stay on him, I instructed, and if he shows any interest in our front door, discourage him politely but firmly. At noon, when the grandfather clock struck 12 with its customary dignity, nothing happened. No frantic phone calls from outraged trustees, no scandal-mongering reporters pounding on the door, no dramatic revelations delivered by special messenger. The threatened exposure of mysterious photographs proved to be as substantial as the empty sleeves in the manila pouch. Wolfe came down from the plant rooms at his usual time, surveyed the empty photographic sleeves with the expression he reserved for particularly unimaginative attempts at deception, and settled into his chair with a grunt that conveyed both displeasure and determination. The noon deadline was theater, he announced, designed to create anxiety rather than actual consequences. We are dealing with someone who understands psychology but lacks the courage of their convictions. Or someone who's testing misses. Fraser's resolve before escalating to real threats. I suggested. Possible, he conceded. We will know more this afternoon. Have you prepared the office? I had indeed prepared the office, arranging chairs in a careful semicircle that would allow Wolfe to observe all the committee members while maintaining his position of authority behind the desk. Fritz had contributed his own form of preparation, a selection of canapes that could serve as either hospitality or ammunition, depending on how the afternoon developed. At precisely 3 o'clock, the committee members began arriving in the staggered fashion of people who have important schedules but recognize the importance of the occasion. Vincent Merton came first, striding through the door with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. He was a compact, powerful man with a jaw that looked carved from granite, and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, settling into the chair closest to the desk. "I trust this won't take long. I have a board meeting at 4:30. Graham Colby arrived next, bringing with him the kind of polished charm that successful lawyers wear like expensive cologne. He surveyed the office with obvious appreciation, complimented the book collection, and positioned himself where he could observe both Wolfe and the other committee members. Dr. Leonid Keston shuffled in looking like a man who had been interrupted in the middle of important research involving plants or chemicals or other things that didn't require him to make conversation with strangers. He carried a worn leather satchel and immediately became absorbed in examining Fritz's flower arrangement with the intensity of someone conducting a scientific study. Iris Quatermain entered with the brisk efficiency of someone who had attended hundreds of committee meetings and expected this one to follow familiar patterns. She was a woman of formidable presence, with sharp features and the kind of intelligent gaze that suggested she had already formed preliminary opinions about everyone in the room. Nora Kent arrived last, looking like someone who had spent the day anticipating an unpleasant dental appointment. She was younger than the others, with auburn hair that seemed to have a mind of its own and eyes that held the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing more than you're supposed to admit. With everyone assembled, the office took on the atmosphere of a faculty meeting at a distinguished university, polite, civilized, and underlaid with the kind of tension that develops when intelligent people gather to discuss matters that could affect their professional reputations. Mrs. Fraser, who had been waiting in the front room, entered with the composed dignity of someone accustomed to presiding over important gatherings. She positioned herself near my desk, her posture erect, her expression serious. Wolfe surveyed the assembled group with the measured attention of a master chef examining ingredients for an unfamiliar recipe. When he spoke, his voice carried easily to every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you are here because someone has involved me in your affairs without my consent. Last night, Mrs. Fraser received instructions to alter a committee vote with the threat that compromising photographs would be delivered to your board of trustees if she refused. The person making this threat used my unlisted telephone number as part of their scheme." He paused, allowing this information to settle. "I find this presumptuous." The silence that followed had weight and texture. Merton's jaw tightened. Colby's professional composure developed a hairline crack. Dr. Keston looked up from the flowers with sudden interest. Miss Quatermain's expression remained neutral, but her fingers interlaced more tightly. Nora Kent seemed to shrink into her chair. "Furthermore," Wolfe continued, "someone has been conducting surveillance of committee members. This suggests a level of planning that goes beyond casual mischief. Someone is very concerned about your deliberations, concerned enough to resort to threats and intimidation." His gaze moved deliberately from face to face. "I intend to discover who." "With respect, Mr. Wolfe," Colby said, his lawyer's training asserting itself, "this seems like a matter for the police." "The police," Wolfe replied, "investigate crimes that have been committed. I investigate presumptions that have been made. Someone presumed to use my telephone number as a tool in their private theater. That presumption will be corrected." It was then that Nora Kent spoke for the first time, her voice small but clear. "The man who was following us yesterday, I saw him again this morning, outside my apartment building." This produced a ripple of attention that was almost visible. Every head turned toward her, and she seemed to wilt under the scrutiny. "Describe him," Wolfe instructed. "Medium height, tan overcoat, clean-shaven. He kept his distance, but he was definitely watching. When I left my building, he was across the street. When I reached the subway, he was behind me. When I got to work." She paused, gathering courage. "I think he followed me here." Saul's surveillance report had just been confirmed by the target herself. Someone was indeed conducting amateur surveillance, and they were bold enough to follow committee members to a meeting with Nero Wolfe. "Professional surveillance," Merton observed, his business instincts engaged, "or someone with more enthusiasm than skill." "The latter, I suspect," Wolfe said. "A professional would not be so easily observed." He turned back to Mrs. Fraser. "You mentioned that preliminary votes have been taken. What was the result?" Mrs. Fraser consulted her papers. "The epidemiology grant was approved unanimously. The algae research received 4 votes in favor, 1 abstention, Dr. Keston felt the methodology needed refinement. The botanical grant was approved by a margin of 4-1. Who dissented?" "Vincent did," she replied, glancing at Merton. He questioned the allocation amount. Merton's expression suggested he didn't appreciate having his position characterized so simply. "I questioned whether $250,000 for greenhouse rehabilitation represented the most effective use of foundation resources," he said. "There are medical research projects that could benefit from that funding." "The botanical program includes significant educational components," Dr. Keston said, speaking for the first time since his arrival. Public gardens serve important research functions beyond their aesthetic value. Wolfe absorbed this exchange with the attention of someone filing information for future reference. Mr. Colby, as legal counsel, you would be familiar with the Foundation's procedures for altering votes. Certainly, Colby replied. Any committee member can request reconsideration before the final announcement. Such requests require a formal motion and a second. If the motion passes, we take a new vote. He paused. However, such requests are unusual. Our preliminary votes are generally considered final, but not legally final. Wolfe pressed. No. The final vote occurs at 4 o'clock, just before the public announcement. It's normally a formality, but theoretically, any allocation could be changed. Wolfe leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. Someone wishes to see the botanical grant altered, he observed. Someone with access to your committee's deliberations. Someone familiar with Mrs. Fraser's personal schedule. Someone with sufficient resources to conduct surveillance. His gaze moved around the room like a searchlight. Someone in this room! The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. The temperature in the office seemed to drop several degrees, and I could feel the tension ratchet up another notch. That's a serious accusation, Colby said finally. It's a logical conclusion, Wolfe replied. The person making threats knew details that are not public information. They knew Mrs. Fraser's schedule well enough to place a card in her possession during a specific event. They knew the internal workings of your committee well enough to reference a specific vote. Most significantly, they knew my telephone number, which suggests either extensive research or inside information about my previous cases. He paused, his eyes moving slowly from face to face. Someone in this room has been planning this for some time. And there it was. The moment when a civilized committee meeting transformed into something considerably more dangerous. The brownstone, which had been merely disturbed by the presence of strangers, was now officially the scene of an accusation that would require either proof or retraction. Wolfe was just getting started, and I had the distinct impression that before the afternoon was over, someone was going to discover that using Nero Wolfe's telephone number as a prop in their private drama had been a serious miscalculation. The game, as they say, was afoot. The silence that followed Wolfe's accusation had the texture of expensive fabric being torn. You could feel the individual threads of composure snapping one by one. I watched the faces around our semicircle with the attention of a poker player studying tells, noting the subtle shifts that people make when they realize the conversation has moved from polite inquiry to direct confrontation. Vincent Merton recovered first, his business instincts asserting themselves like well-oiled machinery. "That's a serious charge, Mr. Wolfe," he said, his voice carrying the controlled authority of someone who had faced down hostile boardrooms. "You're suggesting that one of us is engaged in extortion." "I'm suggesting," Wolfe replied with the patience of someone explaining arithmetic to a particularly slow student, "that someone with intimate knowledge of your committee's operations has attempted to manipulate Mrs. Fraser through threats that involved my telephone number. The circle of people with such knowledge is quite small." His gaze moved deliberately around the room. "You comprise that circle." Graham Colby shifted in his chair, his legal training engaged. "Intimate knowledge could be obtained through other means," he observed smoothly. "Staff members, administrative personnel, anyone with access to committee files or Mrs. Fraser's calendar." "True," Wolfe conceded, "but such persons would lack both the resources to conduct surveillance and the sophistication to obtain my unlisted telephone number. No, Mr. Colby, we are dealing with someone who moves in your professional circles." I reached into my desk drawer and withdrew a stack of clean index cards and my fountain pen. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "you'll each need to provide a written account of your whereabouts between 7 and 11 o'clock last evening. Names, times, and verifiable details, please. There's something about asking educated people to write down their alibis that changes the atmosphere in a room. The air gets thicker. Words get chosen like pearls, and every glance carries a footnote. I distributed the cards and watched the subtle tells that people display when they're deciding between honesty and the convenient lie. Merton wrote like he signed contracts, tight, forward-leaning letters that punched the paper as if it had personally offended him. Colby's handwriting was lawyer-clear, with times noted down to the minute, either because he lived by the half-hour or because he wanted us to think he did. Dr. Keston's script wandered like a root system, with cross-outs and hesitations that suggested his memory was competing with his pen. Iris Quatermain formed letters with the precision of someone who arranged museum exhibits, while Nora Kent wrote with the careful neatness of someone accustomed to filling out forms that would be scrutinized by others. While they wrote, I noticed that Nora's pen hesitated twice over specific times, and her shoulders had the tense set of someone expecting an unpleasant surprise. I collected the cards and handed them to Wolfe, who fanned them like a poker hand before setting them aside. When Wolfe delays reading evidence, he's not being theatrical. He's arranging pieces on a board that only he can see. "Mrs. Fraser," he said, during the intermission at the Philharmonic, "who had access to your rap?" "It was on the back of my chair," she replied. "I spoke with several acquaintances, Mrs. Audrey Hawley, Dr. and Mrs. Moritz from the Symphony Board, and a donor named Hagen. Anyone in the surrounding seats could have placed something in it during the intermission." "A large pool of suspects," Wolfe observed. "But the person who placed that card knew your seating preferences, your social schedule, and the internal workings of your committee. That suggests someone with access to multiple sources of information." It was then that the telephone rang. I answered with my customary efficiency, expecting either Saul with a surveillance report or Fritz announcing that lunch was ready. Instead, I heard a voice that was professionally neutral, but carried an undertone that made my attention sharpen. "Archie Goodwin? This is Caleb Marsh. I believe we should meet." I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe. "Someone named Caleb Marsh wants to meet with us." Wolfe's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Put him through." I uncovered the phone. "Mr. Marsh, you're speaking to Nero Wolfe's office. What can we do for you?" "I understand you've been asking questions about surveillance activities," Marsh said, his voice carrying the kind of professional smoothness that comes with practice. "I may have information that would interest Mr. Wolfe." "What kind of information?" "The kind that involves unlisted telephone numbers and committee members who've been receiving unwanted attention. I'm currently across the street from your building. May I come up?" I looked at Wolfe, who nodded once. "Come ahead, mister." Marsh rang the bell once and wait. After I hung up, Wolfe addressed the committee. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to be joined by someone who may shed light on your situation. I suggest you remain seated and observe carefully." 3 minutes later, I heard the front door chime and went to answer it. Through the one-way glass, I could see a man in his early 30s, clean-shaven, wearing a tan overcoat that had seen better days but still carried itself with dignity. He had the kind of professional good looks that suggested he'd learned to use his appearance as a business tool. "Mr. Marsh," I said, opening the door. "Please come in." I escorted him to the office, where he surveyed the assembled committee with the quick, assessing glance of someone who made his living reading people and situations. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Thank you for seeing me." Wolfe studied him with the attention of a jeweler examining a stone of uncertain quality. "You mentioned surveillance activities, Mr. Marsh. Please be specific." Marsh glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on Nora Kent, who had gone pale at his appearance. "I've been conducting observation work for a client who has an interest in the Holy Foundation's grant decisions. Nothing illegal, just watching and reporting on committee members' movements and meetings." "Your client's name?" I asked. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that," Marsh replied smoothly. "Professional confidentiality." "And your methods?" Wolfe inquired. Standard surveillance techniques. I observe. I document. I report. I don't interfere or threaten. He paused, looking directly at Mrs. Fraser, but someone else has been playing a much more aggressive game. Explain, Wolfe commanded. 3 days ago, I observed another individual conducting surveillance of committee members. Amateur work. He was easily spotted, made no attempt at concealment. Yesterday, I saw him approach Miss Kent outside the foundation building. He nodded toward Nora, who seemed to shrink into her chair. This morning, I witnessed what appeared to be an attempt to pass materials to her. She refused and left quickly. Nora Kent's voice was barely a whisper. He said he had photographs. He wanted me to look at them, to understand what would happen if the botanical grant wasn't stopped. The room erupted in murmurs of surprise and concern. Dr. Kesten leaned forward, his scientific curiosity engaged. Photographs of what? He wouldn't say exactly, Nora replied, her voice gaining strength, but he implied they would damage someone on the committee. He said the botanical grant was a mistake, that it would benefit the wrong people. Merton's jaw tightened. Did he mention me specifically? No, Nora said, but he seemed to know about your opposition to the grant. He said there were others who shared your concerns. Wolfe turned his attention to Marsh. You observed this exchange? I did. The man was persistent, but Miss Kent handled herself well. She refused his materials and left immediately. Describe this other individual, Wolfe instructed. Mid-40s, average height, expensive suit but worn shoes. He carried himself like someone with authority but moved like someone who wasn't accustomed to field work. Professional, but not in surveillance. Iris Quatermain spoke for the first time since Marsh's arrival. That could describe half the lawyers and administrators in the city. True, Marsh agreed, but this particular individual knew enough about your committee's schedule to intercept Miss Kent at precisely the right moment. That suggests inside information. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Marsh, how did you obtain my telephone number? I didn't, Marsh replied promptly. I had no reason to contact you until this morning, when I realized that someone else was conducting a more aggressive operation that might interfere with my own work. Yet someone used my number as part of their scheme, Wolfe observed. Someone with access to information that is not publicly available. Colby cleared his throat. Mr. Wolfe, I should mention that as the Foundation's legal counsel, I maintain files on various individuals who might be relevant to our operations. Private investigators, security consultants, attorneys who specialize in Foundation law. He paused. Your name and contact information might be included in such files. Might be? Wolfe's voice carried a distinct chill. Is included, Colby admitted, along with several other prominent private investigators. It's part of our due diligence procedures. The admission fell into the conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples that reached every corner of the room. Mrs. Fraser turned to look at Colby with an expression that suggested her opinion of the Foundation's legal counsel was undergoing rapid revision. So you had access to my telephone number, Wolfe said to Colby. Who else would have access to these files? The executive committee members, Colby replied reluctantly, and selected administrative staff. Including Miss Kent. Nora nodded miserably. I helped compile some of the background information when I first joined the Foundation. It was part of my orientation. Wolfe absorbed this information with the expression of someone fitting pieces into a complex puzzle. So we have established that multiple people had access to my telephone number. We have also established that someone has been conducting amateur surveillance of committee members and attempting to use photographs as leverage to influence the botanical grant vote. He turned to Marsh. Your professional assessment, Mr. Marsh, is this the work of someone seeking financial gain or someone with a personal agenda? Marsh considered the question carefully. Personal agenda, he said finally. The approach is too crude for professional extortion, but too sophisticated for random mischief. Someone with a specific objective and the resources to pursue it, but without the experience to do it cleanly. And your client's interest in the foundation? Wolfe pressed. Legitimate business intelligence, Marsh replied. My client has investments that could be affected by the foundation's grant decisions. Nothing illegal or unethical, just the kind of information gathering that's standard in competitive industries. Merton leaned forward. What kind of investments? Marsh smiled thinly. The kind that benefit from advances in environmental research and biotechnology. The implication was clear. Someone with business interests had hired Marsh to monitor the foundation's grant decisions, probably to gain advanced knowledge of funding that might affect stock prices or competitive positioning. It was legal, if not entirely ethical, but it wasn't the source of the threats against Mrs. Fraser. Wolfe studied the assembled group with the attention of a master chef examining ingredients for an unfamiliar recipe. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a clearer picture of the situation. Someone with access to foundation files and knowledge of committee procedures has attempted to manipulate your vote through threats directed at Mrs. Fraser. This same individual has been conducting surveillance of committee members and has attempted to involve Miss Kent in their scheme through the use of compromising photographs. He paused, allowing his words to settle. The question that remains is simple. Who among you has both the motive and the means to orchestrate such a campaign? The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Each committee member looked at the others with new suspicion, wondering who among them might be capable of such deception. It was Dr. Keston who spoke first. Mr. Wolfe, I've been thinking about the botanical grant. The funding would go primarily to greenhouse rehabilitation and orchid propagation. Those are areas where I have some expertise, but I have no financial interest in the project. No financial interest, Wolfe repeated. But professional interest? Keston hesitated. I've consulted informally with the garden's director about their needs. Purely in a scientific capacity. Paid consultation? No. Professional courtesy among botanists. Wolfe nodded and turned to Iris Quatermain. Miss Quatermain, your museum has educational partnerships with various institutions. Does this include the Bronx Botanical Garden? We have collaborative programs, she replied carefully. Educational outreach, teacher training, public lectures. The kind of partnerships that benefit both institutions. And would benefit more if the garden received substantial funding for new facilities. Her expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. All educational institutions benefit from improved facilities. Merton had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience. Mr. Wolfe, you're suggesting that someone on this committee is willing to resort to extortion to secure a $250,000 grant. That's a serious accusation. It's a logical conclusion, Wolfe replied. Someone with intimate knowledge of your procedures, access to foundation files, and understanding of individual vulnerabilities has orchestrated this campaign. The circle of people with such capabilities is quite small. Nora Kent had been sitting in increasingly obvious distress throughout this conversation. Now she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. There's something else I should tell you. Every head turned toward her, and she seemed to wilt under the attention. The man who approached me, she continued, he knew things about my background. Personal things. He mentioned my previous job, my student loans, my apartment lease. He said he could make my life very difficult if I didn't cooperate. What kind of cooperation did he want? Wolfe asked gently. He wanted me to provide him with advance copies of press materials about the grant announcements. He said it would help him prepare his documentation. And did you comply? No, she said firmly. I told him I wouldn't be part of whatever he was planning. That's when he said he had other ways to achieve his objectives. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him was equivalent to another man pacing the room. "Miss Kent, did this individual give you any indication of who he was working for?" He said he represented concerned parties who had the Foundation's best interests at heart. He claimed the botanical grant was being pushed through without proper oversight, that there were conflicts of interest that should be exposed. Colby sat up straighter. "What kind of conflicts of interest?" "He wouldn't be specific," Nora replied, "but he implied that someone on the committee had personal or financial reasons for supporting the grant." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar, creating an atmosphere of mutual suspicion that was almost tangible. Wolfe studied each face in turn, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Mr. Marsh," he said finally, "you mentioned that your client has investments that could be affected by the Foundation's grant decisions. Would your client benefit if the botanical grant were rejected in favor of other allocations?" Marsh considered the question carefully. "Possibly. But my client's interests are long-term and diversified. A single grant decision wouldn't significantly impact their portfolio." "Nevertheless," Wolfe observed, "someone is willing to go to considerable lengths to influence this particular decision. The question is whether we're dealing with financial motivation, personal vendetta, or professional rivalry." He reached for the index cards I'd collected earlier and began reading them with the methodical attention he usually reserved for seed catalogs or wine lists. After several minutes, he looked up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "based on your written accounts, it appears that several of you had the opportunity to place the card in Mrs. Fraser's wrap last evening. More significantly, all of you had access to the information necessary to orchestrate this campaign of intimidation." The room was completely silent now, the only sound the distant hum of traffic on West 35th Street and the subtle tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. "However," Wolfe continued, "I believe we are dealing with someone whose motivations extend beyond the immediate question of grant allocation. This is about power, control, and the ability to manipulate institutional decisions through fear and intimidation." He looked directly at Colby. "Mr. Colby, as the Foundation's legal counsel, you redesigned the governance structure to concentrate more authority in the executive committee. This gives you significant influence over the decision-making process." "That was the board's directive," Colby replied smoothly. "They wanted more efficient procedures." "Efficient for whom?" Wolfe asked, "and at what cost?" Before Colby could respond, the telephone rang again. I answered it, expecting another call from Saul or perhaps Fritz announcing that lunch was finally ready. Instead, I heard a voice that was unfamiliar but carried an undertone of urgency that made my attention sharpen immediately. "This is Detective Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins, NYPD, the voice said. "I need to speak with Nero Wolfe immediately. We have a situation that may involve his current case." I looked at Wolfe and covered the mouthpiece. "Pearlie Stebbins. He says it's urgent and may involve our current case." Wolfe's expression suggested that he found the timing either remarkably coincidental or ominously predictable. "Put him through." I handed Wolfe the receiver and settled back to listen to what promised to be an interesting conversation. "Sergeant Stebbins?" Wolfe said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy he reserved for police officers who had earned his respect. "What can I do for you?" I could hear Pearlie's voice through the receiver, though not clearly enough to make out specific words. Whatever he was saying caused Wolfe's eyebrows to lift slightly and his mouth to assume the expression he wore when circumstances had just become significantly more complicated. "I see," Wolfe said after a moment. "When was he found?" Another pause. "And the photographs?" Wolfe asked. A longer pause, during which the committee members sat in increasingly obvious discomfort. "No," Wolfe said finally. "I will not leave this office. If Inspector Kramer wishes to discuss the matter, he knows where to find me. However, I suggest you examine any photographic equipment found at the scene very carefully." He paused. "And Sergeant, You might want to check whether the deceased had any recent contact with members of the Hawley Foundation for Science and Society. He handed me the receiver, and I replaced it while every person in the room stared at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to alarm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome news. "I regret to inform you that a man has been found dead in his apartment on East 73rd Street. He was discovered with photographic equipment and what appears to be surveillance materials documenting the movements of various individuals." The silence that followed was profound and chilling. Nora Kent went white as paper. Mrs. Fraser maintained her composure, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her portfolio. Merton looked like a man calculating potential damage to his reputation. Colby was already thinking like a lawyer, probably considering liability issues. Dr. Keston appeared genuinely shocked. Iris Quatermain looked grimly unsurprised, as if she had been expecting something like this. "Was he murdered?" Colby asked, his legal training asserting itself. "The police are investigating," Wolfe replied. "The circumstances are suspicious." "The man who was following us," Nora said, her voice barely audible. "Is he—" "That remains to be determined," Wolfe said. "However, I suggest that none of you leave the city without informing both the police and my office of your whereabouts." And there it was. The moment when a case involving anonymous threats and mysterious photographs transformed into something considerably more serious. Someone was dead, and that someone appeared to have been conducting surveillance of the very people sitting in our office. Marsh had gone very still, his professional composure intact, but his eyes alert with the wariness of someone who realized he might be in deeper water than he had anticipated. "Mr. Marsh," Wolfe said, "I trust you will make yourself available to the police for questioning." "Of course," Marsh replied, "though I should mention that the man I observed was not the individual I've been monitoring on behalf of my client. This appears to be a third party. A third party with access to Foundation information and knowledge of committee members' schedules," Wolfe observed. "The circle grows smaller, not larger." He looked around the room with the expression of someone who had just realized that his quiet afternoon had been permanently disrupted by forces beyond his control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe we need to have a much more detailed conversation about your foundation, your grant procedures, and exactly who might benefit from the kind of chaos that has just been unleashed. The brownstone, usually a sanctuary of civilized discourse and intellectual precision, had become the center of something that was rapidly escalating beyond mere financial manipulation into the realm of genuine danger. The circle of suspects was complete, but the game had just become considerably more deadly. When Nero Wolfe decides that circumstances require field investigation, he doesn't waste time on elaborate instructions. He simply points you in the right direction and expects you to return with facts that will either confirm his theories or provide him with new ones to consider. This morning, with a dead man on East 73rd Street and a committee full of suspects who had just learned that their quiet professional dispute had escalated into something considerably more dangerous, Wolfe's instructions were characteristically direct. "Archie," he said, settling back into his chair with the deliberate movements of someone who intended to remain stationary while others did the running. "You will examine the deceased's residence, speak with the investigating officers, and then conduct a systematic review of our suspect's recent activities. I want to know who Harold Vance was working for, what materials he possessed, and why someone found it necessary to silence him permanently." The scene of amateur surveillance. Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins met me at the entrance to the brownstone on East 73rd Street, wearing the expression of a man who had started his day expecting routine police work and discovered instead that he was dealing with something that would require actual thinking. The building was the kind of respectable but fading structure that housed people who had once had better prospects and now made do with smaller ambitions. Vance was found by his landlady this morning when he failed to pay his weekly rent, Pearlie explained as we climbed to the third floor. "She has a key and uses it liberally. Natural causes, according to the preliminary examination, but the circumstances are suspicious enough that Kramer wants a thorough investigation. The apartment revealed Harold Vance to be a man who had attempted to transform himself from failed accountant to private investigator without acquiring the necessary skills for either profession. The front room served as both living space and office, with a card table functioning as a desk and filing cabinets that looked like they had been purchased from a bankruptcy sale. But it was the makeshift dark room in the bathroom that told the real story. Vance had invested in professional-grade photographic equipment, expensive cameras, telephoto lenses, and developing chemicals that represented a significant financial commitment. The results of his investment hung on a clothesline stretched across the bathroom. Contact sheets showing surveillance photographs of our committee members taken over the past 2 weeks. He was thorough, if not skilled, I observed, examining the photographs. Mrs. Fraser entering and leaving various buildings, Merton at business lunches, Dr. Keston carrying his worn leather satchel, Iris Quatermain at the museum, and Nora Kent looking perpetually anxious at bus stops and subway entrances. "The interesting part," Pearlie said, "is what's missing." We found empty photographic sleeves labeled with initials HF, VM, LK, IQ, NK, but no negatives. Someone cleaned out the developed film but left the contact sheets. This suggested that Vance's death had not been entirely unexpected by someone who knew what materials he possessed. The removal of negatives while leaving contact sheets indicated either professional thoroughness or amateur panic, depending on whether the person responsible understood the difference between the two. In Vance's desk, I found a folder marked Hawley Foundation, containing newspaper clippings about the foundation's activities, biographical information about committee members, and meeting schedules that were not publicly available. Most significantly, there was a typed note on plain paper. Document all meetings and associations. Particular attention to botanical grant discussions. Report weekly. "Any indication of who hired him?" I asked Pearlie. "Cash payments, no contracts, no client files," he replied. "But his bank records show regular deposits of $500 over the past month, always cash, always on Friday." Foundation inquiries. The Hawley Foundation occupied 3 floors of a midtown building that projected the kind of dignified prosperity that successful philanthropy requires. The receptionist, whose nameplate identified her as Miss Eleanor Vance, possessed the professional composure that comes from years of managing the interface between money and worthy causes. "Mr. Goodwin," she said when I introduced myself. "Mrs. Fraser mentioned that you might be making inquiries on behalf of Mr. Wolfe. How may I assist you?" "I'm interested in the Foundation's security procedures," I said. "Specifically, who has access to committee schedules and member contact information." Her expression became more guarded. "That information is confidential, of course. Only senior staff and committee members have access to detailed schedules. Has anyone outside the Foundation requested such information recently?" "There have been some inquiries," she admitted reluctantly. "A gentleman representing himself as a journalist called several times asking about grant procedures and committee composition, and we've had some unusual interest from what appeared to be business intelligence firms. Can you be more specific about these inquiries?" Miss Vance consulted a logbook with the precision of someone who documented everything. "A doctor, Marcus Kellerman, called 3 times in the past 2 weeks. He identified himself as a botanical consultant and wanted to know about the grant review process. When I explained that such information was confidential, he became quite insistent, claiming he represented parties with legitimate interests in Foundation decisions. The name Marcus Kellerman was not familiar from our committee meeting, but it clearly meant something to someone. I made a note to have Saul investigate Dr. Kellerman's background and current activities. Anyone else showing unusual interest? "Mr. Colby's office requested copies of all committee correspondence last week," she said, "and someone called claiming to be from the State Attorney General's office, asking about our compliance procedures. When I asked for credentials, they hung up. The Botanical Connection. The Bronx Botanical Garden presented a stark contrast to the polished professionalism of the Holy Foundation. Here was an institution that clearly needed the $250,000 grant, with greenhouse facilities that had seen better decades and staff who wore their dedication like comfortable old clothes. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the garden's director, met me in her office, which was filled with botanical journals and grant applications in various stages of completion. She was a woman who had learned to be optimistic about funding possibilities while remaining realistic about institutional limitations. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I understand you're investigating some irregularities related to our grant application. I want to assure you that everything we submitted was completely accurate and properly documented. Dr. Vasquez, has anyone contacted you recently with questions about the grant or the Foundation's decision-making process?" "Several people, actually," she replied, consulting her calendar. Dr. Leonid Keston visited twice to review our orchid propagation plans, purely in a scientific capacity, of course. Miss Quatermain from the Natural History Museum toured our facilities and asked detailed questions about our educational programs. And we had an unexpected visit from a man who claimed to be conducting research for a botanical journal. Can you describe this researcher? Middle-aged, well-dressed, claimed to be writing an article about foundation funding for botanical research. He was particularly interested in our relationships with committee members and whether we had any special arrangements or commitments beyond the standard grant terms. This sounded like it might have been Harold Vance, conducting his amateur investigation. Did he leave any contact information? He said he would call back, but never did. That was about 10 days ago. Dr. Vasquez showed me through the greenhouse facilities that would benefit from the grant funding. The structures were functional but clearly in need of rehabilitation, with glass panels that had been patched rather than replaced, and heating systems that belonged in a museum of industrial archaeology. The grant would allow us to modernize completely, she explained. New glass, improved climate control, expanded research facilities. It would transform our capability for both research and public education. Has anyone suggested that there might be irregularities in how the grant was awarded? Her expression became troubled. There have been some whispers in the botanical community. Nothing specific, but suggestions that the grant process wasn't entirely transparent. Dr. Kellerman, in particular, has been asking questions that seem designed to create doubt about the legitimacy of our application. Academic rivalries. Dr. Marcus Kellerman maintained an office in a converted brownstone near Columbia University, where he operated what appeared to be a consulting practice, focused on botanical research evaluation. The nameplate on his door identified him as Marcus Kellerman, Ph.D., Botanical Research Consultant, and the waiting room contained journals and publications that suggested serious academic credentials. Dr. Kellerman himself was a man in his early 50s with the kind of intense focus that comes from years of detailed scientific work. When I explained that I was investigating irregularities related to the Holy Foundation, his reaction was immediate and revealing. "Finally," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "someone is taking this seriously. The botanical grant is a travesty, Mr. Goodwin. It represents everything that's wrong with foundation funding: personal relationships trumping scientific merit, institutional politics overriding genuine research needs. You have specific concerns about the Bronx Botanical Gardens application." "I have concerns about the entire process," he replied. "Dr. Keston's involvement, for instance. He's been consulting with the garden on their orchid program while simultaneously serving on the committee that awards them funding. That's a clear conflict of interest. Have you shared these concerns with anyone?" "I've tried to," he said, his frustration evident. "I've called the foundation, written letters to committee members, even contacted journalists. But everyone seems content to ignore obvious irregularities as long as the money goes to a popular cause. Dr. Kellerman's office contained extensive files on foundation grants, committee members, and botanical research programs. His research was thorough and his concerns appeared genuine, but there was an intensity to his opposition that suggested personal as well as professional motivation. Dr. Kellerman, did you hire anyone to conduct surveillance of committee members? His expression shifted from frustration to surprise. Surveillance? Of course not. I'm a scientist, not a private investigator. My research methods involve published sources and public records. But you have been asking detailed questions about committee members' activities and relationships. Due diligence, he said firmly. If foundation grants are being awarded based on personal relationships rather than merit, that's a matter of public interest. Committee member motivations. My systematic review of the committee members' recent activities revealed a complex web of professional relationships, personal interests, and institutional loyalties that made simple explanations impossible. Vincent Merton's opposition to the botanical grant appeared to be based on genuine philosophical differences about funding priorities, but his company's environmental compliance issues created potential conflicts that he had not disclosed. Graham Colby's legal work for the foundation gave him access to confidential information and procedures, but also made him professionally invested in avoiding scandals that might damage the foundation's reputation. Dr. Keston's scientific consulting with the botanical garden represented either admirable professional dedication or problematic conflict of interest, depending on one's perspective. Iris Quatermain's museum had educational partnerships with various institutions, including potential competitors of the botanical garden, creating subtle but real conflicts of interest. Nora Kent's background in public relations and her obvious anxiety about the entire situation suggested that she might be more knowledgeable about the Foundation's vulnerabilities than she had initially indicated. Return to the brownstone. When I returned to West 35th Street with my collection of facts, observations, and unanswered questions, I found Wolfe in his office, having just completed his afternoon session with the orchids. He was polishing his glasses with a silk cloth, which indicated that he was prepared to focus his attention on the information I had gathered. "Well, Archie," he said, settling the glasses on his nose with deliberate precision, "what did your peregrinations reveal about our deceased photographer and his various subjects?" I provided him with a comprehensive report. Harold Vance's amateur surveillance operation, the missing negatives doctor, Kellerman's academic crusade against the botanical grant, the complex web of professional relationships among committee members, and the various inquiries that had been made about foundation procedures and committee activities. Wolfe listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the pad he kept beside his chair. When I finished, he sat back and considered the information with the methodical attention he usually reserved for complex orchid breeding programs. "So," he said finally, "we have a dead amateur investigator who is being paid to document committee members' activities, an academic crusader who believes the botanical grant represents institutional corruption, and a collection of committee members whose professional relationships create multiple potential conflicts of interest." "That's the situation in broad outline," I agreed. "The question is whether Harold Vance died because he discovered something genuinely damaging, or because someone wanted to prevent him from discovering it. Or," Wolfe added, "because someone wanted his death to suggest that there was something to discover, thereby casting suspicion on the grant process and forcing a review that might benefit alternative proposals." This was the kind of psychological complexity that made Wolfe cases both challenging and intellectually satisfying. We were dealing not just with motives and opportunities, but with layers of deception designed to create false impressions and misdirect attention. "What's our next move?" I asked. Wolfe reached for the beer that Fritz had positioned beside his chair with perfect timing. "Tomorrow, Archie, you will pay another visit to Dr. Kellerman." I want to know more about his consulting practice and his clients' interests in foundation grants. You will also speak with the Foundation's administrative staff about recent security concerns and unusual inquiries. And the committee members. I will invite them to return here tomorrow afternoon, he said. By then, we should have a clearer understanding of who benefits from Harold Vance's death and who has been orchestrating this campaign of innuendo and intimidation. He took a measured sip of beer and fixed me with the kind of look that meant he had reached a preliminary conclusion about the case. Archie, he said, I believe we are dealing with someone who understands that the appearance of corruption can be as damaging as corruption itself. Harold Vance was not killed to prevent him from exposing a scandal. He was killed to create the impression that there was a scandal to expose. This was vintage Wolfe reasoning. Elegant, counterintuitive, and probably correct. Someone had used Harold Vance's amateur investigation as the foundation for a more sophisticated scheme designed to discredit the botanical grant and the Foundation's decision-making process. The question that remained was whether we were dealing with academic rivalry, corporate competition, or something more personal. But with Harold Vance dead and the Foundation's reputation hanging in the balance, we would need to find answers quickly before someone else decided that murder was an acceptable solution to their problems. The legwork had provided us with facts, but facts without context are merely data. Tomorrow, we would begin the process of transforming data into understanding and understanding into justice. Because in Nero Wolfe's world, the truth always emerges eventually, but sometimes it requires considerable assistance from those who know where to look for it. The morning after my educational tour of Harold Vance's photographic ambitions and doctor, Kellerman's academic crusade, I arrived at the brownstone to find Fritz arranging fresh chrysanthemums with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested either deep satisfaction with the world order or preparation for war. Given the previous day's invasion of committee members, I suspected the latter. Good morning, Fritz, I said, accepting the coffee he poured with the precision of someone measuring medicine. Any overnight disturbances to report? He paused in his flower arranging, his expression shifting to something I recognized as Fritz's version of controlled alarm. There is a thing, he said carefully. It is small, but it is wrong. Fritz's catalogue of wrongness ranges from newspapers delivered late to the collapse of Western civilization, with roughly equal weight given to each. But when he uses that particular tone, experience has taught me to pay attention. What kind of thing? The kitchen, he said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. This morning, when I came down, the copper pot on the third hook was turned. Not much, perhaps 30 degrees. But I do not turn pots 30 degrees from their proper position. I followed him to the kitchen where he pointed to the offending cookware with the gravity of someone identifying evidence at a crime scene. The pot in question hung exactly where it belonged, gleaming with the kind of cleanliness that suggests regular use and religious maintenance. But Fritz was right. It was turned slightly inward, disrupting the perfect alignment of handles that he maintained with Swiss precision. Could you have brushed against it yesterday when you were serving the committee? His look suggested I had just questioned the law of gravity. I've served in this kitchen for more years than some of your committee members have been breathing, Archie. I do not brush against my own equipment. The missing evidence. With Fritz's cosmic disturbance duly noted, I went to the office to begin my morning routine. I had left my desk in perfect order the previous evening, notes filed, papers stacked, and the original threat card that Mrs. Fraser had given us placed carefully in the top right drawer of my desk, beneath my notepad where it would be safe but accessible. I opened the drawer to retrieve the card for another examination of the typeface, and felt my stomach drop to somewhere around my ankles. The card was gone. I pulled the drawer out completely and set it on the desk, conducting the kind of systematic search that archaeologists use when they're looking for pottery shards. Everything else was exactly where I had left it. Pens, rubber bands, spare notepads, the roll of dimes I keep for emergencies, and a folded list of telephone numbers that I update with the regularity of someone paying taxes. But the small white card with its typed threat, "Call 2-125-559-040 at midnight. Tell him you will reverse the vote," or "the photographs go to the trustees," had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. I didn't panic. Panic is for amateurs and people who haven't spent years working for Nero Wolfe. Instead, I conducted a methodical search of the entire office, checking every surface, every drawer, every possible location where a small white card might have migrated during the night. Nothing had been disturbed except for the absence of that one specific item. The wastebasket contained only our own discarded papers. The floor showed no signs of intrusion. The windows were locked from the inside, and the security chain on the front door had been properly engaged when I left the previous evening. Yet someone had entered the office, located the one piece of evidence that directly connected the threats to our unlisted telephone number, and removed it with surgical precision. There was something else, a faint trace of an unfamiliar scent in the air. Not unpleasant, but foreign to the usual atmosphere of leather, old paper, and the lingering aroma of Wolfe's after-dinner cigars. It was subtle, almost metallic, like the smell of old copper or rain on pavement. Wolfe's fury. When Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at his customary 11 o'clock, he entered the office with the measured dignity of someone who expected the world to remain exactly as he had left it. He settled into his chair, reached for the morning paper, and was unfolding it with his usual deliberation when I delivered the news. "The threat card is missing," I said without preamble. "Someone took it from my desk drawer sometime during the night." Wolfe's hands stopped moving. The newspaper remained half-opened, suspended in the air like a frozen gesture. For 5 full seconds he didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even appear to breathe. Then, very slowly, he set the paper aside and fixed me with a stare that could have been used to cut glass. "Explain," he said, and the single word carried enough weight to crush a small building. I provided him with a complete report. The missing card, Fritz's displaced pot, the absence of any signs of forced entry, and the faint metallic scent that lingered in the office air. Wolfe listened without interruption, his expression growing more dangerous with each detail. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. The silence that followed had texture and weight, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. When he opened his eyes again, they held the kind of cold fury that I had seen only a few times in our long association. "Someone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "has presumed to enter my house uninvited, to violate the sanctity of this office, and to remove evidence from my desk." Each word was precisely articulated, as if he were carving them from stone. "That is an unacceptable presumption." He reached for the bell cord and gave it a sharp pull. Fritz appeared with the promptness of someone who had been expecting a summons. "Fritz," Wolfe said, "you mentioned the displaced pot. Did you notice anything else unusual this morning? Any other changes, however small?" Fritz considered the question with the gravity of someone being asked to testify before Congress. "The front hall," he said finally. "There was a faint scent. Not unpleasant, but foreign, like metal that has been handled." "When did you first notice this scent?" "When I came down at 6:30. It was strongest near the office door." Wolfe nodded slowly. "Thank you, Fritz. Please ensure that all doors and windows remain locked until further notice, and if anyone calls requesting admission, you will inform me before responding." After Fritz withdrew, Wolfe turned his attention back to me. "Archie, contact Saul Panzer immediately. I want this building under surveillance, and I want to know if anyone has been watching our activities." Delivered provocation. At 12:30, just as Fritz was announcing that lunch was ready, the doorbell rang with the kind of insistent urgency that suggested either emergency or deliberate provocation. Through the one-way glass, I could see a messenger with a small padded envelope addressed to Nero, Wolfe, in block letters. I accepted the delivery and brought it to Wolfe, who examined it with the suspicious attention of someone who had learned not to trust unexpected gifts. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper bearing the same typed message as our missing card. Call 212-555-9040 at midnight. Tell him you will reverse the vote, or the photographs go to the trustees. Attached to the paper was a strip of photographic negative, carefully cut to show a single frame. When I held it up to the light, I could make out the image of Mrs. Fraser in conversation with an unidentified man in what appeared to be the lobby of the Philharmonic. "A replacement," Wolfe observed, his voice carrying the kind of controlled rage that precedes volcanic eruptions. "Our trespasser wishes us to understand that the removal of evidence is merely a temporary inconvenience. He can provide substitutes at will." Same typeface, I noted, comparing the new message with my memory of the original. Same slight imperfection in the letter R, but different paper stock, cheaper quality. Indeed, he wishes to demonstrate both capability and contempt. He takes our evidence, then returns it in degraded form, like a cat bringing a dead mouse to its owner. Wolfe's mouth compressed into a thin line. This is not merely theft, Archie. It is psychological warfare. Strategic response. The afternoon brought a call from Saul Panzer, who had positioned himself where he could observe our building and the surrounding neighborhood. "Someone's been watching," he reported. "Professional work, but not perfect. I found cigarette butts in a doorway across the street. Same brand, different times of day over the past 3 days. Also, there are scuff marks on the fire escape of the building behind you, suggesting someone climbed up for a better view of your back garden. Any indication of how they gained entry?" "The lock on your back gate shows signs of being picked," Saul said. "Old-fashioned technique, but skillfully done. Whoever it was knew what they were doing." When I relayed this information to Wolfe, he absorbed it with the expression of someone fitting pieces into a complex puzzle. "So," he said, "we have established that our trespasser is both skilled and patient. He has been observing our routines, studying our security measures, and planning his intrusion with considerable care." He paused, considering the implications. "The question is whether this represents escalation or desperation." "Could be both," I suggested. "Maybe the original plan isn't working as expected, so they're applying more direct pressure." "Possible. But I suspect the trespass serves a dual purpose, to demonstrate capability and to provoke a reaction. Someone wishes to see how we respond to direct challenge." Wolfe reached for his beer and took a measured sip while contemplating the afternoon's revelations. "Archie," he said finally, "contact the committee members and inform them that I will receive them here tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Tell them that new evidence has come to light that requires their immediate attention." "All of them?" "All of them, including Mr. Marsh, if he can be located. I want everyone who was present during yesterday's meeting to return for what I suspect will be a more definitive conversation. And the police. Not yet. Inspector Kramer will have his opportunity when I am ready to present him with a complete solution. For now, we will handle this matter privately." The violated sanctuary. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the office floor, I found myself thinking about the psychology of the trespass. Someone had violated the brownstone not for material gain, the missing card had no intrinsic value, but to send a message. They wanted us to know that our sanctuary was not inviolate, that our evidence was not secure, and that they could reach us whenever they chose. But they had made a fundamental miscalculation. By violating Wolfe's personal space, they had transformed what had been a professional obligation into a personal vendetta. The man who could sit motionless for hours while contemplating the behavior of orchids was now motivated by something far more immediate and dangerous than mere intellectual curiosity. Fritz served dinner that evening with a kind of grim efficiency that suggested he understood the household was now in a state of siege. The locks were checked twice, the security chain remained engaged, and both Fritz and I found ourselves listening for sounds that didn't belong to the normal evening routine of the brownstone. Wolfe ate in contemplative silence, occasionally pausing to consider some aspect of the case that only he could see. When he finally spoke, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who had reached a decision. "Archie," he said, "tomorrow's meeting will resolve this matter. Someone has presumed to use my house as a stage for their private drama, and they will discover that the performance has consequences they did not anticipate." "You know who took the card?" "I have strong suspicions," he replied. "But suspicions require proof, and proof requires the kind of confrontation that can only occur when all the players are present and accounted for." He finished his wine and set the glass aside with deliberate precision. "The trespass was meant to intimidate us, Archie. Instead, it has provided us with the final piece of information we needed to solve this puzzle." As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the day's events. Someone had indeed trespassed upon our sanctuary, but in doing so, they had awakened something in Nero Wolfe that was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The subtle violation of his domain had transformed him from a reluctant participant in someone else's scheme into an active predator, hunting his prey. Tomorrow's meeting promised to be educational for everyone involved, though I suspected that our mysterious trespasser was about to receive a lesson in the consequences of underestimating the man who lived at the old brownstone on West 35th Street. The game had become personal, and when Nero Wolfe takes something personally, the outcome is rarely in doubt. The morning after our uninvited visitor's demonstration of contempt brought the kind of multiple crises that transform a civilized investigation into something resembling urban warfare. I was examining the faint metallic scent that still lingered in the office when the telephone delivered the first of several unwelcome developments. "Archie Goodwin," I answered, expecting either Saul with a surveillance report or Fritz announcing that breakfast was ready. Instead, I heard the controlled but strained voice of Mrs. Helene Fraser. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm calling from the Foundation. We've had a break-in, and I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately." The Foundation violated. 20 minutes later, I stood in Mrs. Fraser's office examining the aftermath of what could only be described as psychological warfare conducted with surgical precision. The intruder had gained access using security codes, spent exactly 36 minutes inside according to electronic logs, and left behind a carefully arranged display that transformed ordinary surveillance photographs into instruments of intimidation. 8 professional quality prints were spread across Mrs. Fraser's desk like evidence in a courtroom. Each showed a committee member engaged in perfectly innocent activities that could be interpreted as suspicious by someone with sufficient imagination and malicious intent. Vincent Merton entering a medical research facility. Graham Colby in conversation with a woman outside the Natural History Museum. Dr. Keston examining orchids in a private greenhouse. Iris Quatermain dining with 2 unidentified men. Nora Kent leaving her apartment while glancing nervously over her shoulder. Harold Vance's work, I observed, recognizing the amateur angles and distinctive grain from the contact sheets in his bathroom darkroom. But these are fresh prints from old negatives. Someone's been developing his film collection. A typed note accompanied the photographs. "Committee members have undisclosed conflicts of interest. The botanical grant serves private agendas. The trustees deserve full disclosure." Mrs. Fraser studied the images with the expression of someone watching her professional reputation being held hostage. "These show nothing improper," she said. "Ordinary business meetings, social encounters, professional consultations." "That's exactly the point," I replied. "They don't need to show actual wrongdoing. They just need to create the appearance of secrecy and suggest that deeper investigation might reveal genuine scandals." Media pressure and public exposure. The second crisis arrived via Lon Cohen at the Gazette, whose voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone delivering bad news with professional detachment. "Archie, I've got a packet," he said. "Anonymous delivery to our tips line, BCC'd to at least 3 Hawley Foundation trustees. Time stamped 40 minutes ago. Contents? A tidy dossier of surveillance photos with captions suggesting conflicts of interest in the botanical grant decision. Lots of insinuation, carefully worded to avoid libel charges. And your boss gets a starring role. Private investigator Nero Wolfe engaged to influence grant outcome. Your office numbers included in bold type. This was escalation with precision timing. Our opponent was applying pressure simultaneously at multiple points, intimidating Mrs. Fraser with photographs, threatening public exposure through media leaks, and attempting to implicate Wolfe in the very corruption he was investigating. "Can you sit on it?" I asked. "For now," Lon replied. "But one trustee has already forwarded it to colleagues, and there's a boutique scandal sheet that loves this kind of story. The narrative references today's 4 o'clock vote. Someone wants this to explode before the final decision. The botanical misdirection." The third development came via Dr. Elena Vasquez at the Bronx Botanical Garden, her voice carrying the kind of controlled outrage that suggests professional dedication under assault. "Mr. Goodwin, we had a break-in last night. House 7, the orchid propagation facility. No equipment stolen, but several mother plants were deliberately damaged, cut and left to desiccate." When I relayed this to Wolfe, his reaction was immediate and revealing. His hand, which had been resting motionless on his chair arm, closed into a fist and slowly opened again. "Vandalism," he said, "designed to create the impression of botanical expertise gone wrong. Tell Dr. Vasquez to preserve every fragment under glass. I want to examine the nature of these cuts." An hour later, standing in the humid warmth of House 7, I could see what had provoked Wolfe's interest. The cuts were brutal and ignorant, slashing through pseudo-bulbs at random angles, severing water reserves, maximizing shock and damage. A botanist seeking to harm plants would have done it cleanly and efficiently. This was the work of someone trying to create the appearance of botanical knowledge while demonstrating its complete absence. Dr. Kesten arrived while I was examining the damage, moving with the kind of urgent concern that suggested genuine distress. His reaction to the vandalism was immediate and visceral. "Barbarians," he said softly, kneeling beside the damaged plants. "No one with botanical training would choose these cuts. They're designed to cause maximum suffering with minimum understanding." Nora Kent's revelation. The most significant development came when I returned to find Nora Kent waiting in our front room, clutching a small leather portfolio and looking like someone who had spent the night expecting catastrophe. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I need to tell Mr. Wolfe something important. About the background research Mr. Colby asked me to compile." In Wolfe's office, she provided a complete account that transformed our understanding of the case. Graham Colby had requested comprehensive background checks on all committee members, financial records, professional associations, personal relationships, previous controversies, ostensibly for defensive purposes, but creating a database that could easily be weaponized for offensive operations. "Complete intelligence files," Wolfe observed after she finished her account. "The kind of information that would allow someone to identify vulnerabilities, predict behavior, and apply pressure with surgical precision." "I never thought of it that way," Nora admitted. "But yes, the information could certainly be used to embarrass or discredit anyone on the committee." She also revealed that her apartment had been searched the previous night, with intruders leaving a note threatening unfortunate publicity if she didn't cooperate. The pressure was being applied systematically to the most vulnerable target. The surveillance network reports. Saul Panzer's afternoon report confirmed that our opponent was operating with increasing boldness and decreasing subtlety. Professional surveillance of committee members had been observed, along with attempts to approach Nora Kent directly. The mysterious Russell Dade, the man in the tan overcoat, had been identified as a corporate consultant with connections to Merton Petrochemical. Most significantly, Caleb Marsh had been assaulted that morning, his camera and surveillance materials stolen by two men who knew exactly what they were looking for. "The net is tightening," Saul reported, "but it's not pretty. Someone's getting desperate and making mistakes." Police pressure and murder. The final pressure came via Inspector Kramer, whose voice carried the kind of controlled fury that suggested his investigation had taken an unwelcome turn. "Wolfe," he said, "Harold Vance didn't die of natural causes. The autopsy shows acute anaphylactic shock from a rare orchid pollen introduced into his system. He was murdered." The implications were immediate and ominous. Vance's death had been carefully orchestrated to appear natural, while eliminating the amateur photographer who might have provided inconvenient testimony. The use of orchid pollen as a murder weapon directly implicated the botanical community and cast suspicion on Dr. Keston. "We're looking at anyone with access to rare botanical specimens," Kramer continued, "and I want statements from everyone who was at your meeting yesterday." Wolfe's strategic response. When all the pressure points had been reported and analyzed, Wolfe sat in his chair with the motionless concentration of a predator calculating the precise moment to strike. The violation of his sanctuary, the systematic intimidation of witnesses, and the escalation to murder had transformed his professional interest into something far more personal and dangerous. "Archie," he said finally, "contact all committee members and inform them that I will receive them here at 3 o'clock tomorrow. Tell them that new evidence has come to light regarding Harold Vance's murder, and that their cooperation is essential for both their own protection and the Foundation's reputation." "All of them?" "All of them, including Mr. Marsh if he can be located, and Mr. Dade if Saul can arrange it. I want everyone who has been involved in this elaborate charade present for what I suspect will be a definitive conversation." He reached for his beer and took a measured sip while contemplating the afternoon's revelations. "Someone has presumed to use my house as a stage for their private drama, Archie. They have violated my sanctuary, intimidated witnesses, and escalated to murder in pursuit of their objectives. Tomorrow they will discover that such presumptions carry consequences they did not anticipate." The increased pressure had indeed created the conditions for resolution, but not in the way our opponent had intended. By escalating to murder and direct intimidation, they had provided Wolfe with both the motivation and the evidence necessary to bring their scheme to a decisive conclusion. The brownstone had been disturbed, but now it was preparing to restore order through the application of superior intelligence and implacable will. Tomorrow's gathering would not be a committee meeting, it would be a reckoning. There are mornings when you can feel the brownstone itself preparing for battle, and this was one of them. Fritz moved through his routines with the kind of precise efficiency that suggested he was loading ammunition rather than arranging breakfast, and the faint metallic scent from our uninvited visitor had been replaced by something sharper, the smell of Wolfe's controlled fury mixed with his determination to restore order to his violated domain. He descended from the plant rooms at 11 o'clock, carrying himself like a general who had spent the night studying maps and was now ready to position his forces. The evidence from our investigation was arranged on his desk with mathematical precision. Harold Vance's surveillance photographs, the threatening notes, Nora Kent's intelligence files, and the botanical vandalism reports, all organized in careful stacks that suggested both comprehensive understanding and strategic intent. "Archie," he said, settling into his chair with the deliberate ceremony of someone preparing to conduct a symphony. "Today, we arrange the board. Our opponent believes they have applied sufficient pressure to force capitulation. They are about to discover that presumption carries consequences they did not anticipate." The typewriter's confession. My first stop, was Wyman's shop on 23rd Street, where the old craftsman greeted the replacement threat card like a jeweler, examining a suspicious diamond. He positioned it under his fluorescent lamp, hummed thoughtfully, and let me watch him fall in love with the evidence. Royal quiet. Deluxe, he pronounced with the satisfaction of someone naming a long-lost relative. Late 40s, but somebody had repair work done. See that R? Like it went to sea and came back with a limp. That's handwork. Some amateur bent it, someone else bent it back. Not quite to factory specifications. How many royals with that particular affliction in Manhattan? I asked. Enough to populate a small neighborhood, he replied. But that R is a fingerprint if I ever saw one. You find me a royal with that hitch, and I'll marry the two of them in any court you choose. When I returned with this intelligence, Wolfe showed his teeth in what passed for a smile and tapped his forefinger on the chair arm with the satisfaction of someone who had just received confirmation of a theory. Excellent, he said. The net tightens. Now we trace the scanner. Digital fingerprints, Lon Cohen at the Gazette, proved equally helpful when I called about the morning's leaked documents. Take your microscope to the metadata, I told him. I want the machine ID embedded in those PDF files. 7 minutes of electronic archaeology later, he returned with the kind of information that makes investigators purr. Scanner tag embedded GLC 782-admin-A, he reported. That string means nothing to most people, but it's candy to me. These boutique legal shops brand their devices because billing departments love labels. Want to guess whose office has a Konica with that exact network signature? Surprise me. Colby and Tarson, 11th floor. Same building as the Hawley Foundation, different elevator bank. I can't swear the scans were done on their machine, but the PDF producer string doesn't lie. When I relayed this to Wolfe, he absorbed it with the expression of someone fitting the final piece into a complex puzzle. Confluence noted, he said. Hold that information in reserve. We'll need it for the proper moment. Strategic communications with the technical evidence secured, Wolfe began his psychological positioning campaign. He had me contact each committee member individually, delivering messages that were precisely calibrated to create maximum anxiety while revealing minimum information. To Vincent Merton, Mr. Meyer. Wolfe has obtained evidence regarding corporate surveillance activities and their connection to Harold Vance's murder. Your presence at 3 o'clock tomorrow is essential for clarifying your position and protecting your company's interests. To Graham Colby. Legal complications have emerged regarding foundation governance and potential criminal liability. Mr. Wolfe requires your immediate consultation, including any portable office equipment you may use for foundation work. To Dr. Keston. Botanical evidence in Harold Vance's murder directly implicates the orchid community. Mr. Wolfe needs your expertise to prevent a miscarriage of justice that could damage legitimate botanical research. To Iris Quatermain. Museum partnerships with botanical institutions are now under criminal investigation. Your testimony is required to clarify institutional relationships and protect your professional reputation. To Nora Kent. Your background research files have become central evidence in a murder investigation. Mr. Wolfe will provide protection in exchange for complete cooperation. Each message was designed to isolate the recipient psychologically while suggesting that cooperation offered the only path to safety. Classic Wolfe positioning. Creating conditions where the guilty party would feel compelled to act while the innocent would seek clarification. The decoy trap. The afternoon's tactical masterpiece involved Nora Kent's forced correspondence with her mysterious tormentors. Wolfe had her compose a message to the Proton Mail address they had provided. Have obtained preliminary media advisory stating botanical grant to be reaffirmed at 4 o'clock. Can leave printed copy and envelope at specified location for your review. The location was a coffee shop on 37th Street that we had used before for exchanges requiring discretion. Corner booth near the ficus, I told her. Envelope taped under the seat. It makes people crawl, and I enjoy watching that. At 1:15, I left the brownstone carrying a convincingly fat envelope stuffed with blank paper and one carefully crafted decoy press release. Fritz rang Wolfe at 1:22 as arranged, providing theatrical cover for my departure. Saul Panzer positioned himself in a doorway with strategic lint on his collar, while Fred Durkin took up station across the street, studying a vending machine with the intensity of someone conducting a scientific experiment. At 1:34, Russell Dade appeared wearing his tan overcoat and the expression of someone who had been promised easy money for simple tasks. He made the retrieval with tourist's curiosity and thief's speed, then headed uptown with Saul and Fred providing invisible escort. 20 minutes later, Saul called with confirmation, handoff completed. Dade delivered the envelope to Suite 1108, Colby and Tarson, counselors at law. Woman with legal haircut took it through an inner door, and someone started printing like their life depended on it. Physical preparation. While our surveillance team tracked the decoy materials, I prepared the office for what promised to be our most decisive confrontation. The chairs were arranged in a precise crescent that would allow Wolfe to observe facial expressions and body language while maintaining his position of authority. The evidence was displayed where everyone could see it, organized to suggest comprehensive knowledge without revealing specific conclusions. Fritz contributed by preparing refreshments that served dual purposes: hospitality for the innocent and subtle intimidation for the guilty. Nothing says, "This may take considerable time," quite like the careful arrangement of coffee service and substantial refreshments. The final pressure. By 4 o'clock, with all the pieces positioned and the trap fully operational, Wolfe made his final preparatory call to Inspector Kramer. "Inspector," he said when Kramer's voice came through like an approaching thunderstorm, "you may wish to attend a discussion tomorrow at 3 o'clock. The subject is Harold Vance's murder and the systematic campaign of institutional manipulation that led to it. You will be asked to make an arrest." "You got a confession?" Kramer asked. "I have a conclusion," Wolfe replied. "Confessions are a lower order of evidence. Tomorrow you will witness the application of superior logic to inferior presumption." After he hung up, Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who had achieved perfect strategic positioning. "Archie," he said, "tomorrow we will demonstrate to someone who has presumed to use my house as a stage for their private drama that such presumptions carry consequences they failed to anticipate." The board arranged. As evening settled over the brownstone, the atmosphere had transformed from violated sanctuary to armed fortress. The technical evidence was secured, the psychological pressure applied, the surveillance network activated, and the trap fully operational. Our opponent had been maneuvered into a position where every move would either expose their guilt or compound their legal jeopardy. Wolfe spent the evening in contemplative silence, occasionally making notes on the pad beside his chair. When he finally spoke, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who had calculated all possible outcomes. "The trespass was meant to intimidate us, Archie," he said. "Instead, it provided the final confirmation we needed. Someone has been attempting to use crude imitations of sophisticated methods to achieve their objectives. Tomorrow I shall demonstrate the difference between amateur presumption and professional competence." The positioning was complete. Our opponent believed they had cornered us with their campaign of intimidation and murder. Tomorrow they would discover that they had merely walked into a cage of their own construction, with Nero Wolfe holding the key. The brownstone had been violated, but it was about to exact its revenge through the application of superior intelligence and implacable will. The board was arranged, the pieces positioned, and justice was preparing to make its move. The endgame was ready to begin. At 3 o'clock precisely, the brownstone transformed from sanctuary to tribunal. The committee members filed in with the measured dignity of people who understood that their professional reputations hung in the balance, each carrying themselves with that particular combination of composure and anxiety that comes from knowing you're about to be judged by someone whose intellectual capacity you respect, but whose conclusions you fear. The office had been arranged with mathematical precision. The chairs formed a careful crescent that allowed Wolfe to observe every facial expression and body movement while maintaining his position of absolute authority behind the desk. The evidence from our investigation was displayed where everyone could see it: threatening notes, surveillance photographs, technical analyses, organized to suggest comprehensive knowledge while revealing nothing of his specific conclusions. Inspector Kramer had positioned himself near the door with the expression of someone who expected to be either entertained or infuriated, possibly both. Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins stood at attention by the window, his presence serving as both security and witness to whatever revelations were about to unfold. The opening gambit. Vincent Merton entered first, moving with the controlled energy of someone who had spent the morning calculating potential damage to his corporate interests. Graham Colby followed, wheeling a small case that suggested he had brought documentation to support whatever position he might need to defend. His professional composure remained intact, but something in his eyes suggested he had spent considerable time reviewing his legal options. Dr. Keston shuffled in looking like a man who wished he were anywhere else, perhaps examining rare fungi in a quiet laboratory. Iris Quatermain arrived with her usual brisk efficiency, though her confidence had developed hairline cracks. Nora Kent entered last, clutching her portfolio with the desperate grip of someone holding her only lifeline. Mrs. Fraser, who had been waiting in the front room, entered with the composed dignity of someone accustomed to presiding over important gatherings, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her chair arms. When everyone was seated, Wolfe surveyed the assembled group with the measured attention of a master chef examining ingredients for a complex recipe. The silence stretched until it became almost tangible. Wolfe's declaration. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room, "you're here because someone among you has presumed to use my house as a stage for their private drama. They have violated my sanctuary, intimidated witnesses, conducted systematic surveillance, and escalated to murder in pursuit of their objectives." He paused, allowing this accusation to settle like smoke in still air. "That presumption will now be corrected." The silence that followed had weight and texture. Each committee member looked at the others with new suspicion, wondering who among them might be capable of such elaborate deception. "Harold Vance was murdered," Wolfe continued, "not to prevent him from exposing corruption, but to create the impression that there was corruption to expose. Someone understood that the appearance of scandal could be as damaging as actual wrongdoing, and they orchestrated a campaign designed to discredit the botanical grant through fear, innuendo, and ultimately homicide. The technical evidence. I rose from my desk and began distributing copies of our technical findings, each document representing hours of meticulous investigation. The threatening messages, I announced, were typed on a Royal Quiet Deluxe typewriter with a distinctive defect in the letter R, a bent serif that creates a unique fingerprint. Mr. Wyman at the typewriter repair shop on 23rd Street confirmed that this particular defect is the result of amateur repair work, making it virtually unique in Manhattan. I placed the next set of documents before them. The leaked photographs sent to trustees and media were scanned on equipment registered to Colby and Tarson, counselors at law. The metadata embedded in the PDF files contains the network signature GLC782-admin-A, which corresponds to a specific Konica scanner in their offices. Graham Colby's professional composure developed visible cracks. "Our office equipment is accessible to many people," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "True," Wolfe replied, "but the person who used that equipment also had comprehensive knowledge of Foundation procedures, committee member vulnerabilities, and my unlisted telephone number. The circle of people with such capabilities is quite small. The surveillance network exposed Wolfe leaned forward slightly, his gaze moving methodically from face to face. Mr. Russell Dade, the courier who has been observed following committee members, was traced yesterday to your law offices. Mr. Colby, he delivered materials directly to your paralegal, Miss May Kendall, who then processed them using your office equipment. He turned to Nora Kent. Miss Kent, you were approached by someone who revealed intimate knowledge of your personal circumstances, your student loans, your apartment lease, your employment history. This information came from the comprehensive background files that Mr. Colby requested you compile on all committee members. Nora nodded miserably. He said he represented concerned parties who wanted to protect the Foundation's reputation. Concerned parties, indeed, Wolfe observed. Parties concerned enough to hire Harold Vance for surveillance, to orchestrate break-ins, to leak documents to the press, and ultimately to commit murder when their amateur investigator became a liability. The botanical misdirection, Doctor. Keston had been listening with growing agitation. Mr. Wolfe, if you're suggesting botanical involvement in this murder— On the contrary, Doctor. Keston, Wolfe interrupted. The vandalism at the Botanical Garden was designed to implicate you while demonstrating complete ignorance of plant physiology. The cuts were brutal and random, the work of someone trying to create the appearance of botanical knowledge while revealing its complete absence. He fixed his gaze on Colby. You sought to cast suspicion on Dr. Keston while simultaneously discrediting the botanical grant. But you made a fundamental error. You underestimated the intelligence of actual botanists. The murder method revealed Harold Vance was murdered with pollen from Dendrobium noble, Wolfe continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering a verdict. This orchid produces pollen that causes severe allergic reactions in sensitive individuals. The pollen was introduced into his morning coffee through a gelatin capsule that dissolved completely, leaving only the biological evidence. Inspector Kramer leaned forward. Where would someone get access to such specific materials? From Meridian Laboratories, Wolfe replied, a pharmaceutical research company that specializes in allergy testing and treatment. They are also a client of Colby and Tarson, providing Mr. Colby with both access to the murder weapon and knowledge of its effects. The direct accusation. Wolfe's gaze settled on Graham Colby with the weight of absolute certainty. Mr. Colby, you redesigned the Foundation's governance structure to concentrate power in the executive committee, power that you, as legal counsel, could influence and control. When the committee voted to approve the botanical grant, despite your opposition, you chose to create a scandal that would force reconsideration. Colby's hands had begun to tremble slightly. This is all circumstantial speculation. It is a pattern of evidence, Wolfe corrected, that admits of only one conclusion. You possessed the distinctive typewriter that produced the threatening messages. You had access to the scanner that produced the leaked documents. You maintained the intelligence files that mapped committee members' vulnerabilities. You had professional access to the pharmaceutical materials used in the murder. And you had the motive, institutional control, threatened by democratic decision-making. The final evidence. I reached into my desk drawer and withdrew a small evidence bag containing a typewriter key, the letter R with its distinctive bent serif completely broken off. This key was found in the wastebasket of your private office, Mr. Colby, I announced. You attempted to repair the defect that made your typewriter identifiable, but succeeded only in making it worse. When that failed, you tried to destroy the evidence entirely. Colby stared at the broken key as if it were a venomous snake. The color drained from his face as he realized that his careful planning had been undone by a single piece of metal no larger than a fingernail. The psychological breakdown. You killed Harold Vance, Wolfe continued relentlessly, because he was becoming a liability. His amateur methods were drawing attention, and he was demanding more money for his silence. You used a method you believed would appear accidental while directing suspicion toward the botanical community. The botanical grant was wrong. Colby suddenly exploded, his professional composure finally cracking. $250,000 for greenhouse rehabilitation when there are medical research projects that could save lives. The committee was making decisions based on personal preferences rather than scientific merit. So you decided to correct their judgment through murder and intimidation, Wolfe observed with deadly calm. I never intended for anyone to die, Colby said, his voice breaking. Harold was supposed to document conflicts of interest, create enough doubt to force proper oversight, but he started asking questions, threatening to expose the operation. I couldn't let him destroy everything I'd worked to build. The confession, for several moments, the office was completely silent except for the distant hum of city traffic. Then Graham Colby seemed to collapse in on himself, the weight of accumulated evidence finally crushing his resistance. I was trying to protect the Foundation's integrity, he whispered. The botanical grant was being pushed through without proper oversight, based on personal relationships rather than institutional need. You were trying to control institutional decisions through fear and manipulation, Wolfe corrected. That is not integrity, mister. Colby, that is tyranny disguised as principle. The arrest Inspector Kramer rose from his position by the door with the satisfaction of someone who had just witnessed a masterpiece of detection. Graham Colby, you're under arrest for the murder of Harold Vance and conspiracy to commit extortion and institutional fraud. As Kramer read him his rights, Colby looked around the room with the expression of someone who had just realized that his elaborate scheme had been nothing more than amateur theater performed before a professional audience. I was trying to save the Foundation from itself, he said as the handcuffs clicked into place. You are trying to remake it in your own image, Wolfe replied. The Foundation will survive your presumption, mister. Colby, your reputation will not. The restoration of order. After Kramer led Colby away, the remaining committee members sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that their legal counsel had been conducting a campaign of murder and intimidation while presenting himself as their protector. Mrs. Fraser was the first to speak. The botanical grant will proceed as planned, she said firmly. The committee's decision was legitimate, regardless of Mr. Colby's attempts to discredit it. Dr. Kester nodded slowly. The garden's orchid propagation program will benefit legitimate research. That was always the intention. Vincent Merton looked like a man who had just realized how close he had come to being implicated in a murder investigation. My opposition to the grant was based on legitimate concerns about resource allocation, he said. I had no knowledge of this scheme. Your opposition was noted and respected, Wolfe replied. Dissent based on principle is the foundation of democratic decision-making. Manipulation through murder is not. The final resolution. As the committee members departed, each carrying the weight of having witnessed the exposure of institutional corruption, Wolfe settled back into his chair with the expression of someone who had successfully defended his territory against invasion. The brownstone has been restored to its proper order, he observed with satisfaction. The presumption has been corrected and justice has been served. I looked around the office, noting that the faint metallic scent from our uninvited visitor had finally dissipated, replaced by the familiar aromas of leather, old paper, and intellectual satisfaction. One question, I said. How did you know he would break down so completely? Because, Archie, Wolfe replied, reaching for the beer that Fritz had positioned beside his chair with perfect timing. Mr. Colby made the classic mistake of the amateur criminal. He believed that superior planning could compensate for inferior character. When his elaborate scheme was exposed as mere theatricality, he had nothing left but the truth. The office gathering had served its purpose. Graham Colby's campaign to manipulate Foundation decisions through murder and intimidation had been exposed, and the brownstone's violated sanctuary had been restored to its proper dignity. Justice had been served with the precision and intellectual satisfaction that made Nero Wolfe cases both challenging and deeply rewarding. The botanical grant would proceed, the foundation's integrity had been preserved, and someone who had presumed to use our house as a stage for their private drama had learned that such presumptions carry consequences they had not anticipated. The game was over, and the right side had won. The click of handcuffs has a finality that even the most eloquent confession cannot match. As Inspector Kramer led Graham Colby through the front hall of the brownstone, the man who had orchestrated murder and institutional manipulation with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker looked diminished, ordinary. Just another criminal who had confused intelligence with wisdom and legal training with moral authority. The committee members who remained in the office sat in the kind of stunned silence that follows the collapse of a carefully constructed world. They had entered believing they were dealing with external threats to their foundation's integrity. They were departing with the knowledge that the greatest threat had been sitting at their own conference table, taking minutes and billing by the hour. The systematic unraveling Wolfe surveyed the remaining group with the expression of someone who had just completed a particularly satisfying intellectual exercise, but I could see he wasn't finished. Graham Colby's confession had resolved the question of Harold Vance's murder, but there were still threads to be tied, motivations to be explained, and lessons to be administered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone delivering a final verdict, "you have witnessed the exposure of a scheme that combined institutional knowledge with personal ambition, legal expertise with criminal methodology, and professional respectability with murderous intent. It is worth examining how such a combination became possible." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving methodically from face to face. Mr. Colby understood that modern institutional corruption rarely requires crude bribery or obvious fraud. In an age of complex governance structures and professional oversight, the most effective manipulation occurs through the creation of doubt, the suggestion of impropriety, and the careful cultivation of fear. Vincent Merton shifted uncomfortably. "You're saying he used our own ethical standards against us?" "Precisely," Wolfe replied. He understood that conscientious people would rather sacrifice their preferences than risk institutional scandal. By creating the appearance of corruption where none existed, he could force reconsideration of decisions he opposed on philosophical grounds. The technical architecture of deception. I rose from my desk and began arranging the evidence in chronological order, creating a timeline that demonstrated the systematic nature of Colby's campaign. "The scheme began 6 weeks ago," I announced, "when Mr. Colby commissioned comprehensive background investigations of all committee members, ostensibly for defensive purposes, but actually to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited for manipulation." Mrs. Fraser's expression hardened. "The files Nora compiled. He weaponized our own due diligence procedures." "Indeed," Wolfe confirmed. He then hired Harold Vance to conduct surveillance, providing him with committee schedules and member photographs. Vance was told he was documenting conflicts of interest for legitimate oversight purposes. The poor man believed he was serving institutional integrity. Dr. Keston looked up from his contemplation of Fritz's flower arrangement. "When did it cross the line from manipulation to murder?" "When Harold Vance began asking questions about his payments and demanding to know who was funding his operation," Wolfe replied. Amateur operatives eventually developed professional curiosity. Vance wanted to understand the larger context of his work, which made him a liability rather than an asset. The orchid pollen gambit. Wolfe's expression grew colder as he continued. The murder method was chosen with particular malice. Dendrobium nobile pollen, introduced into Vance's morning coffee through a gelatin capsule, would cause fatal anaphylactic shock while appearing to be natural causes. But more insidiously, it was designed to cast suspicion on the botanical community, thereby discrediting the very grant he opposed. Barbarians, Dr. Kestin said softly, and I wasn't sure if he was referring to the murder or the vandalism at the botanical garden. The damage to those orchids, it was pure ignorance disguised as expertise. Precisely, Wolfe said. Mister? Colby understood that actual botanists would recognize the ignorance behind the cuts, but he calculated that the general public would see only the connection between plant damage and plant-based murder weapons. It was misdirection designed to create guilt by association. The violation of sanctuary. Wolfe's voice took on a personal edge that I recognized as dangerous territory for anyone who had crossed him. The trespass into this house, the theft of evidence, the delivery of replacement materials, these were not acts of desperation. They were acts of calculated contempt. Mr. Colby wished to demonstrate his control, to show that he could penetrate our sanctuary and manipulate the very evidence we collected. He got personal, I supplied, knowing that Wolfe's particular sensitivities about the brownstone had transformed this from a professional obligation into something far more dangerous. Indeed, Wolfe said, genuine anger flickering in his eyes. He presumed to use my unlisted telephone number as a prop in his vulgar melodrama to suggest that he could outmaneuver me on my own ground. Such presumption cannot go unpunished. The broader implications. Mrs. Fraser had been listening with the expression of someone watching her professional world being deconstructed and rebuilt. What you're describing could happen to any organization with complex governance structures. Correct, Wolfe replied. Modern institutions are particularly vulnerable to this form of manipulation because they depend on trust, expertise, and collaborative decision-making. Someone with legal training and institutional access can exploit these dependencies for personal objectives. He paused, allowing this observation to settle. The defense against such manipulation is not increased security or additional oversight, but rather the cultivation of intellectual courage, the willingness to distinguish between legitimate concerns and manufactured crises. Character and consequence. Nora Kent, who had been sitting in quiet distress, finally spoke. I helped him compile those background files. I provided him with personal information about all of you. I made this possible. Miss Kent, Wolfe said with unexpected gentleness, you were manipulated by someone who understood how to exploit professional dedication and personal insecurity. Your cooperation was obtained through deception, not corruption. Men speak of integrity and mean dominion, Wolfe continued, his voice taking on the philosophical tone that meant he was drawing larger lessons from specific events. They invoke oversight and mean obedience. They call fear prudence, and when confronted, call their coercion reluctant. Mr. Colby was sure he was right. He starved his conscience to feed his certainty. That is a pernicious diet. The restoration of order. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the office floor, the committee members began to depart, each carrying the weight of having witnessed sophisticated institutional corruption exposed and defeated. Mrs. Fraser was the last to leave. The Foundation will survive this, she said firmly. The botanical grant will proceed as planned, and we will ensure complete transparency in all future decisions. Mr. Colby's actions were his alone. Mrs. Fraser, Wolfe replied, institutions are only as strong as the individuals who comprise them. Your committee's willingness to seek the truth rather than accept convenient explanations is what made justice possible. The final satisfaction. After the office emptied and the brownstone returned to its customary quiet, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence. When he finally spoke, it was with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully defended his territory against invasion. The violation of this sanctuary was meant to intimidate us, Archie, he said. Instead, it provided the final confirmation we needed. Someone who would break into my house to steal evidence would also murder an amateur investigator to prevent exposure. The trespass revealed the character of our opponent as clearly as a fingerprint. Fritz appeared with fresh beer and the kind of satisfied efficiency that suggested the household had successfully repelled an invasion. The locks were secure, the evidence was filed, and the reputation of the brownstone had been not merely defended, but enhanced. Colby's complaint was not frivolous, Wolfe observed, taking a measured sip. Institutions confuse charity with fashion. Money chases applause as capriciously as it avoids shame. $250,000 for glass can look vain beside a centrifuge. Yet you defended the glass, I said. I did not defend glass, he replied, eyes half closed in satisfaction. I defended a system against commandeering. The foundation was flawed but legitimate. His method was illegitimate and thus corrupt. If a thing wishes to be better, it must be persuaded, not compelled by fear. The reveal was complete. Graham Colby's elaborate scheme to manipulate institutional decisions through murder and intimidation had been exposed in all its sophisticated corruption. The brownstone's violated sanctuary had been restored to its proper dignity, and justice had been served with the intellectual precision that made Nero Wolfe cases both challenging and deeply satisfying. The truth had emerged, as it always does, through the application of superior logic to inferior presumption. The botanical grant would proceed. The foundation's integrity had been preserved, and someone who had presumed to use our house as a stage for their private drama had learned that such presumptions carry consequences they had failed to anticipate. The game was over, and the right side had won. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the brownstone had exhaled. You could feel it in the way the floorboards settled, in the quality of light filtering through the office windows, and most definitively in the precise angle of Fritz's copper pot, which had been restored to its proper position with the gravity of a constitutional amendment. The faint, metallic scent of trespass had been replaced by the familiar aromas of coffee, floor wax, and Fritz's unwavering belief that order was a moral obligation. The telephone, which had been the instrument of our midnight summons to this affair, now behaved with appropriate discretion. No anonymous threats, no surveillance reports, no crisis calls from Foundation trustees. The only ring before 11 came from Lon Cohen at the Gazette, who prefers to be first at my ear, even when the news has been sleeping under his desk since dawn. "Archie," he said with professional satisfaction, "Kramer's office confirms murder 2, conspiracy, and assorted garnish for Colby. The Hawley Foundation's board met in emergency session last night. They're shocked, but not surprised, which is a neat trick of institutional language. We're running the story at noon under Foundation lawyer, murdered detective to control grant decisions. Your boss gets called a private investigator known for his resistance to interference." "That's diplomatic," I observed. "My editor wanted notoriously immovable, but I saved that for his obituary," Lon replied. "The botanical grant proceeds as planned, plus the Foundation's adding oversight procedures to prevent future manipulation. Clean ending all around." The institutional reckoning. At 11, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms carrying himself like a general whose territory had been successfully defended. He settled into his chair with the deliberate ceremony of someone reclaiming a throne that should never have been threatened, and extended his hand for the morning mail. The first envelope was creamstock with Mrs. Helene Fraser's monogram. Inside was a check for our fee plus expenses, accompanied by a note in her precise handwriting. On behalf of the Hawley Foundation, gratitude for defense rendered not to a grant, but to governance. Wolfe read it, nodded slightly, and passed both check and note to me without comment. The check went where checks go, the note he kept at the corner of his blotter, a place of honor just short of framed. The second envelope contained Russell Dade's written statement for Kramer, along with a brief apology. I thought I was doing errands. I was helping a murder. I'm sorry. Dade had provided names, dates, and the complete sequence of his deliveries to Colby's office. When I passed it to Wolfe, He read it and flicked it back with a grunt. "Kramer will decide what remorse buys," he said. Dr. Elena Vasquez called at noon to report that the Botanical Gardens Board had voted to proceed with the greenhouse rehabilitation with additional security measures to prevent future vandalism. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "your intervention saved not just our funding, but our reputation. The orchid propagation program will be expanded to include educational partnerships with local schools. Professional consequences." The afternoon brought a parade of calls documenting the widening consequences of Colby's exposure. Dr. Marcus Kellerman, the botanical consultant whose academic crusade had provided convenient cover for criminal activities, called to apologize for his role in creating the atmosphere of suspicion that Colby had exploited. "My concerns about the grant process were legitimate," he said, "but I allowed them to be weaponized for illegitimate purposes. I've learned the difference between constructive criticism and destructive suspicion." Nora Kent's situation resolved more positively than expected. Mrs. Fraser had not only refused her resignation, but offered her a promotion to senior research analyst with responsibility for developing new security protocols. "I learned that intelligence gathering for legitimate purposes can be weaponized by people with criminal objectives," Nora told me. "From now on, I'll be more careful about access to sensitive information." Police satisfaction. Inspector Kramer stopped by at 4 o'clock, ostensibly to collect final evidence, but actually to deliver what passed for his version of professional appreciation. "Wolfe," he said, settling into the red leather chair, "this was good work. Colby had us completely misdirected with that orchid pollen. We were ready to arrest half the botanical community before you demonstrated the pharmaceutical connection." "The murder method was chosen for misdirection," Wolfe replied. "Mr. Colby understood that obvious connections often conceal subtle truths. Plant-based poison suggests botanical knowledge, but Dendrobium nobile pollen specifically required pharmaceutical expertise." Kramer nodded. His confession was complete. Names, dates, methods, contacts at Meridian Laboratories. "The DA says it's solid. He'll plea." Evening restoration. Fritz served dinner that evening with ceremonial attention that suggested he was celebrating the successful defense of the brownstone against invasion. The menu featured fresh brook trout with herb butter, roasted potatoes with rosemary, and vegetables prepared with religious devotion. Wolfe ate with his usual focused intensity, savoring each mouthful with the deep satisfaction of a man whose palate was as refined as his intellect. After the cheese and coffee, with the last vestiges of the day's complications dissolving into the comfortable warmth of the dining room, Wolfe leaned back in his chair, a rare gesture of complete contentment. "Appetite," he said as if tasting the word, "is the most honest of our engines and the least honest of our excuses." Colby's appetite was not for money, not at first. It was for dominion, the power to arrange other men's judgments to suit his conviction. He named it principle, as tyrants do when they wish to avoid mirrors. He paused, his mouth flattening slightly. His method, fear, cannot be principle's instrument. If you compel a conclusion, the conclusion is yours alone and you are left with its weight. Institutions are vulnerable to such men because they worry more about reputation than truth. They will trade sound decisions for the illusion of cleanliness. But truth, like hunger, is ill-satisfied by appearances. "Even when it's hidden in a Royal Quiet Deluxe," I added. He allowed the corner of his mouth a half-inch of movement. "There are implements and there are hands, Archie." The machine did not err. The hand did. The final settlement. As the evening settled over West 35th Street, the brownstone conducted its ancient ritual of returning to proper order. The locks were secure, the evidence was filed, and the chain was set. Fritz completed his kitchen duties with the satisfaction of someone whose domain had been successfully defended. At 10 o'clock, I sat at my desk watching Wolfe do nothing, which is to say, think, which is to say, make the world behave a little better than it did an hour before. That's the closest thing to religion I practice. You took this case, I said, because someone used our number and because orchids were involved, but also because of something you won't say between meals. Pooey, he said, amiably for once. I took it because I eat. Understood? But as the man who arranges the chairs, I reserve the right to supplement the menu. You also took it because someone tried to rearrange a house he had never entered. You don't stand for that. His eyes closed briefly, like a curtain drawing on a play whose ending was already written. No, he admitted, I do not. The next morning brought normal business. I typed neat reports and filed neat bills. The orchids were misted at 9 and 3, and I refrained from telling them they had made a cameo in a murder case. Fritz regained his full serenity and added a syllable of forgiveness to Mrs. Fraser's name when he spoke it. At 11, I checked the chain, shut the lights, and listened to the house settle into its proper quiet. The phone stayed silent. If the city had anything to say at midnight, it said it to someone else. Just in case, though, I left a fresh stack of index cards in the drawer where the threat had once been. If the world wants to call at the wrong hour again, we're ready. Not listed in the phone book. Don't get ideas. But where it counts. The case of the midnight call was closed, and the brownstone could return to its proper business, providing sanctuary for those who seek truth and justice in an increasingly presumptuous world.